Dr. Ethan Cole was walking to the break room when his pager rang. Cursing, he checked the message and saw that he was being called into radiology. It was one of those nights. More precisely, one of those weeks. He was tired, sleep-deprived, and the only thing that kept his body going was coffee. Coffee because, unfortunately, the hospital did not have a stash of illegal drugs. Ethan was just starting his career, but the hospital or patients weren't interested in such minor details. To them, he was the fresh face of a miracle doctor making his rounds. "Yes?" he asked, looking into the radiology department. "We need your opinion on this picture," said the blonde doctor inside. "Do you think it's an infection? The lungs look clean. There are no tumors or lesions," he concluded after a quick glance. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the obvious cleavage that his colleague kindly showed him. "Dr. Kowalski, you have." He hesitantly pointed down. "Dr. Kowalski is my father. Call me Callie," she replied, licking her lips. Before he could call her Callie, she reached out and took his elbow. "Your night shift doesn't have to be as bad as usual. I can do something about this." Ethan gently removed her hand, all the while holding her gaze with his blue eyes. He put his right hand forward, showing off his wedding ring. Callie looked at him disappointed. "Come on, how often do you even see her?" "Not as often as I would like." "You spend most of your time in this place. When was the last time you went on a date? When was the last time you even had a cup of coffee together?" Honestly, Ethan had to think, remembering that it was a few weeks ago. His work has recently consumed him completely. Callie snuck up on him and offered him a cup of the worst instant coffee in Manhattan, which he gulped down gratefully. "I am also a doctor. I understand. These are the hours we have to spend at work. No one else understands why we are away from home so often. Zoe is a nurse. I'm sure she understands. No one will understand this unless they have gone through pre-med, medical school, residency, and masters. You and I went through fire and water to get here." Before he could say anything, Callie spoke again, lowering her voice. "Marriages with doctors don't last long. My father pays child support to 3 different women. The only person who can understand this is another doctor." Ethan just stared at her for several long minutes. Her eyes were bloodshot, highlighted by dark circles underneath them. "You need to sleep, Callie. You need it." He hurried out, disappearing again into the crowd of the hospital. New York Presbyterian was one of the busiest hospitals, even on a slow night. Nurses, orderlies, and doctors ran from one door to another. He checked his watch and realized that he would have the next hour free. Heading to the break room, he took out his phone and dialed the first number on the speed dial. Several beeps rang before Zoe answered. "Hello, dear," she said sleepily into the phone. "Hello? How was your day?" "Tiring as always, but I think yours was even worse." "Don't be sad. I have the day off tomorrow when Spencer starts his shift. I can spend the whole day at home." "You know I'll have to work late tomorrow," she said sadly. "You've been late a lot lately," says the one who's halfway through his 24-hour shift, she replied back. "You know that we have a shortage of people." "It's the same story everywhere, Zoe," he sighed. They exhaled at the same time, feeling exhausted. Ethan felt his exhausted body hurt more and more every second. "We can handle it. I know we can handle it. We can handle it. I love you, Ethan. I love you too." He hung up and collapsed on the sofa. A couple of doctors nearby were discussing something. He checked his watch again. There were only 10 hours left until Spencer came to relieve him. Ethan prayed to all the gods he knew so that he wouldn't be late. Having found a moment of peace, his thoughts began to wander. He took out his phone and scrolled through the photo gallery. There were countless pictures of him and Zoe. Some are from cafes, bistros, art galleries, shopping centers, and cinemas. Her wavy brown hair and dazzling smile shone through every photo. She looked beautiful, the same as she came to him every time he closed his eyes. He opened the album with their vacation outside the city. This was more than a year ago, when he still had time to make plans. Each photo was associated with tender memories. 10 years together. Ethan Cole and Zoe Morneau were high school sweethearts. From lab partners in biology class to hosts for a school fundraiser, they did it all together. The defining moment came when, at just 18 years old, he proposed to her after graduation, and she said yes. 18-year-olds rarely make wise decisions. When they decide to get married, it almost always ends in disaster, sooner rather than later. Ethan had a sneaking suspicion that his friends were making a bet on how many months Zoe could last as Zoe Morneau Cole. They had grandiose plans, too big for their small town. They went to New York to start a family. Ethan finished his degree and then worked overtime at a community clinic so Zoe could graduate from medical school for nursing. Zoe tried her best to turn their terrible one-bedroom apartment into something resembling a home. Even in the worst times, and there were many, they always knew that they had each other. This meant much more than how much money they brought home. The memory of her smile, the sound of her laughter, and the warmth of her touch kept Ethan going. His phone rang, and he saw that it was a friend calling. "Hello, Brian. What do you need?" A woman was admitted to the emergency department after a serious road accident. She has severe internal injuries. The kidneys are about to fail, and our nephrologists are on vacation. Replacements are not board certified. Then call one of them. They're both out of state and won't be back until tomorrow. We need to operate on her tonight, or she will die of kidney failure. Do you have a free operating room and surgeon? We need to check, but I think so. Can you do me a favor and take over this case? In an hour, I will send her to the hospital by ambulance. We'll have to talk to the boss. Ethan ran his hand through his disheveled hair. Okay, send it. I'll see what can be done. Thank you, Ethan. I'm your debtor. Then let Zoe rest. She works so much overtime that I barely see her. There was an awkward silence on the line. What overtime? Zoe doesn't get paid overtime. You are sure? Yes, ma'am. I have to check the overtime logs myself before they go to the accounting department. I would know if she worked overtime. I'm sure you missed something. Maybe she works unofficially. The nurses' union would rip my head off if I tried something like that, and I love my head. Just check again, okay? Okay, and I'll send you a patient right now. I'll assemble a team. Ethan hung up and thought for a moment. It didn't make any sense. His tired brain didn't want to think about it for long, so he stood up and got busy preparing the operating room and the surgical team. Probably an error in Brian's notes. An alternative didn't even occur to him. The doctor who replaced Ethan was half an hour late. Ethan cursed him the entire time he rode the subway to his apartment. The other passengers looked in surprise at his shabby appearance as he barely dragged himself to the elevator, but he didn't care. When he reached his door, he could barely stand. Almost crawling, he reached the sofa and immediately fell asleep. It was much more comfortable than the one in the hospital break room. Their apartment was not bad modest, but a big improvement from their first home in East Harlem. Honestly, any place was better than that spider den with no running water. Fortunately, the worst is over. They will live here a little longer, and then they will finally buy a house. Ethan woke up to two sensations, warmth and humidity. He raised his head and saw his wife kneeling by the sofa. She pleasured him very passionately. "Did you sleep well?" Zoe asked with a smile. "Yes, but I woke up even better." "When did you return?" "Just now. I saw that you had fallen asleep on the sofa and thought, what could be more pleasant than waking up your beloved husband?" "You have a good imagination," Ethan said, affectionately stroking her hair. "Now sit down so I can get to work on this properly." Ethan, of course, did not refuse such a wonderful awakening, quickly sat down more comfortably on the sofa and leaned back. Ethan felt the strength return to his exhausted body. Fatigue disappeared, giving way to waves of pleasure. Ethan gave in to the waves of pleasure. She leaned back on the carpet, looking at him with the flirtatious smile that he loved more than anything in the world. "This is how I like to wake you up," she said. "What about dinner out?" Ethan checked his watch, cursing at the late hour. "In the menu on the kitchen shelf, there is a phone number for Sichuan Palace. Just don't order too much. I don't have a particularly good appetite." But you haven't eaten anything all day. I know. I guess I lost my appetite from all that coffee. He looked at her stern gaze for a couple of seconds and then sighed. I haven't been taking care of myself much lately, I understand. But we both knew what we were getting into. Zoe remained adamant. Ethan leaned down and kissed her softly on the lips and then on the forehead. Everything will work out. Ryder and Matthews will be back next week, and the workload will be lighter. Okay, she agreed reluctantly, heading to the kitchen to order Chinese food. I hope you don't die from overwork before this. I'll change into something more comfortable. Ethan started switching channels, but found nothing but tabloid news and reality TV. He turned off the TV and wondered if he should take a shower. Darling, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I spoke with Brian today. He turned around and immediately felt dizzy. By something more comfortable, Zoe meant sheer panties and a lacy bra that left very little to the imagination. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as she smiled and seductively licked the tip of her finger. The poor courier from Sichuan Palace rang the doorbell several times before being forced to drive back with their order. It's just a misunderstanding with Brian's notes. Of course it is. Nothing else. Ethan felt suffocated in his tuxedo. The bow tie had long since tightened to the level of a noose, and the cufflinks hurt his hands painfully with every movement. A gray-haired man continued to talk endlessly about the wonderful work of the hospital and its plans for the future. If death from boredom were possible, Ethan would be on the verge. He noticed that several waiters had disappeared through a side exit, presumably for a cigarette break. Looking around, he decided to follow them to escape for a while. It was raining outside. The roads were almost empty. Ethan stood under the awning over the service exit, looking at the clouds of cigarette smoke swirling around him. Want? He turned to his right and saw Dr. Kowalski taking a long drag from her Camel cigarette. She handed him the pack. No, thank you. I just went out to breathe and hide from this unbearable charity evening. Callie took a drag, causing the end of her cigarette to glow brightly. The rain intensified, sheaves of water lashed the road and walls. What do you think? Ethan asked, taking out a pendant from his inside pocket. Callie took it and opened the clasp to reveal pictures of Ethan and Zoe inside. Very nice. Where did you get this? Ordered to order. There is a place on Lexington Avenue that makes these special pendants. Zoe is lucky, she said quietly, taking another drag. I wish I could be half as happy. Ethan tucked the pendant back into his tuxedo. Callie looked at him for a long time, as if she was undressing him with her eyes. You should switch to the nicotine patch, Ethan said, desperately trying to change the subject. I would go crazy without these cigarettes, she said, throwing the ashes onto the sidewalk. They will kill you. We all die eventually, Ethan. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the phone ringing. Hello, Brian. Ethan, I checked and double-checked all overtime logs, work schedules, and log sheets. I'm telling you, Zoe hasn't asked for or received overtime in months. It just shows how sloppy you guys at Montefiore are with your accounting. I called her an hour ago, and she told me she picked up an extra shift today. This is impossible. I personally made a schedule for today. Ethan, are you in touch? Ethan. The call ended. Ethan's gaze was drawn to the restaurant across the street. It was one of those expensive establishments that far exceeded his and his wife's salaries. The rain made it difficult to see everything clearly. He came closer, emerging from under the canopy and exposing his face to the raindrops. Everything around him ceased to exist as soon as his senses focused on one object behind the glass of the restaurant. Mrs. Zoe Morneau Cole, dressed in an elegant red designer dress, sat at a table with another man, a fair-skinned, impeccably dressed, and well-groomed man. They laughed and talked animatedly. Rain and darkness hid Ethan, but he saw the couple clearly enough. Ethan felt sick. His stomach churned and his face contorted in pain at the sight. Standing in the rain, he desperately wished his eyesight would fail him. But the eyes continued to show the scene where his wife was sitting with another man over a glass of Chardonnay. He bent over, feeling streams of water running down his face. Every part of his body went numb. My mind exploded with bittersweet memories. Somewhere, something went terribly wrong. He looked up again, full of disbelief, and saw Zoe and the stranger kissing. Her lips closed on his. The kiss lasted an unbearably long time. Every detail and nuance of it was forever imprinted in Ethan's memory with unbearable pain. We all die in the end, but part of Ethan Cole died before the rest. The road, the hotel, Callie's gaze, all of this became just a hazy memory as he ran home, or, as it was now called, to the place that he once shared with the woman who betrayed him. He became physically ill. His exhausted legs barely carried him to the sink before he emptied the half-digested remains of his charity dinner into it. He sat down against the wall, his wet face mixed with a few tears. That kiss, the way she tilted her head and took her tongue into her mouth, all this came back to his memory again and again. Ethan stood up and dried himself off, then took a bottle of single malt whiskey from the cabinet. No glass or water was needed. He took a long sip and placed the bottle next to him. "You're not sleeping yet." Ethan just sat by the chair with an empty bottle of single malt whiskey next to him. His tuxedo became a makeshift rug, and his shirt was undone several buttons. The tie was casually draped over his chest, complementing his tousled hair. Overall, he looked like a pretty well-dressed homeless person. "What happened, Ethan?" Zoe asked worriedly. She put her bag down and sat down next to him. Ethan was gloomily silent. The charity evening couldn't be that bad. He turned his head and looked at her with a blank expression. His glassy eyes looked in her direction, not focusing on anything in particular. "If you're hungry, I can cook something. Just give me a minute to change into something more comfortable." Her second change of clothes of the day. So many thoughts were swirling around Ethan's head. Regret, bitterness, and a feeling of deep betrayal. It was all too much for his face to express. Everything was seething inside him. Meanwhile, Zoe returned in her nightgown, unaware of the bitterness growing in her husband. We again had a meeting with representatives of the trade union. More and more of us are being fired. He didn't even realize what she was saying. His life became a blur where he didn't know anyone anymore. Everything he knew and valued became completely meaningless, reduced to the incoherent thoughts of a man whose ground had disappeared from under his feet. "Ethan," he woke up and looked at her. She looked like a stranger, dressed in the likeness of someone he once knew. "Ethan, what's wrong with you? You haven't said a word to me since I came back." He stood up, grabbing a chair for support. His limbs shook before he grabbed her shoulders and pushed her against the wall. His already unbuttoned trousers came off in a matter of seconds. "What?" Before she could finish speaking, Ethan lifted her nightgown and began to roughly have sex with her. His mind was too dull to think about what was happening. All the humiliation and pain that he felt was embodied in his every move. His lips curled, but he didn't say a word. Zoe arched her neck, trying to kiss him. Her lips were approaching his, but Ethan remembered how just recently these same lips touched another man. The whole scene replayed in his head, down to the smallest detail. The way she tilted her head, the way her seductive lips merged with those of others. Now they seemed to him dirty, foreign, not at all the same as those that belonged to his beloved wife. He turned away from her lips and buried his face in her shoulder, preferring to look at the empty wall rather than into her eyes. His married life flashed before him in memories. He remembered working in a hospital and then working part-time at a private clinic so Zoe could study to become a nurse. He remembered how every night, when he came home, his body ached from fatigue, and how Zoe turned to him, making this pain insignificant. Now it all seemed like a lie, a twisted, cruel joke that fate had played on him. And no one even bothered to laugh. Zoe leaned against the wall. Her eyes were closed, a blissful smile on her face. "Damn, now I'll have to take even more overtime if you greet me like this every time." Overtime. This is a lie. Ethan walked out the front door. He clenched his fist and hit the wall. Pain shot through his forearm. He winced and noticed a trickle of blood dripping from his hand. But Ethan was bleeding deep inside himself. Sophie Montoya was a third-generation immigrant from Cuba living in New York City. Her family always did their best to be patriotic towards their new homeland. Her grandfather fought in Vietnam and even received an award for his service. My father served in the Gulf War before becoming a police officer. Sophie herself served 2 tours in Afghanistan and then joined the New York Police. After a few years, she realized that her investigative skills could be more profitable in the private sector and became a private investigator. Sophie worked as an insurance investigator at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Health insurance companies required that all claims be reviewed by her first before they reached them. After all, they didn't want hospitals to deceive them the same way they deceived ordinary people. She was rumored to be good at her job, her skills honed by years of work in the police force and then in private investigations. Sometimes she still took assignments as a private investigator. So Ethan Cole felt he had to meet her. "Wait, do you think your wife is cheating on you?" "I'm sure of it. And instead of meeting with a lawyer, you came to me." Ethan rubbed the bags under his eyes. Sophie looked at his exhausted appearance with curiosity. "You look terrible. And don't talk." Sophie took out a small notepad and began taking notes. Then she closed the notebook and looked at him. "I hope you understand that if you have already seen her kissing someone else in public, then she really is cheating. Are you sure you want to see more than you've already seen?" "What are you doing now, my psychotherapist?" Ethan responded sharply. "I'm just a private detective who has seen this situation 100 times already. You're not looking for photos and videos to trample her into the dirt. You are looking for a shocking truth that will make you finally take off your rose-colored glasses. You want confrontation, you want answers. And all I can tell you is that sometimes it's better not to see it. You can still get a divorce and move on without seeing your marriage fall apart. Isn't it already late?" "Not yet, Ethan. So I'll ask again, are you sure you want to know? Just confirm whether she's cheating on me or not," he said tiredly. "Everything you find will be only for me." She chuckled to herself. "You're a masochist, Ethan. Do you know that?" "Okay, I warned you," she said, turning back to the notepad on her desk. "Do you want me to call you if there is an opportunity to catch them red-handed?" "Yes, I think I need to see this for myself." There was an awkward silence. Sophie leaned forward and looked at him with sympathy. "You're not the first person to ask me to confirm my wife's infidelity. Believe me, it's always better to just leave. Rip off this band-aid and start over. It will hurt, but it will pass." Ethan smiled sadly. She crossed her arms on the table. "Now let's discuss my hourly rate." "Honey, I'm home." And not a moment later, Zoe answered with a wide smile. "Come and tell me what you think about it." Ethan walked up to the kitchen and saw his wife handing him a spoon with the prepared dish. He tried it gratefully. "Don't tell me," he said, intently remembering. "Chicken breast cooked with basil and thyme." "Crap, I can't hide anything from you, right?" She laughed, turning back to the boiling pan. "Just like Mom cooked." "With some pepper," Ethan said, feeling a slight burning sensation in his throat. "She would be proud of you, you know. You are now a great doctor." "Yes, of course I would be proud," Ethan replied, hugging Zoe from behind. "Enough about her. Let's talk about my beautiful wife. If you continue like this, you will be left without dinner." But that didn't stop him, and his hand slid under her blouse, undoing a couple of buttons. She sighed softly, aroused by his touch. "You have 5 minutes to stop, otherwise there won't be dinner." "To hell with it," he whispered in her ear. Waves of pleasure spread through her body, tearing a low moan from her chest. "The only dinner I need right now is you, and I want you in the most cruel way." He pressed himself to her neck, showering her with kisses, starting from her delicate skin and up to her ear. She put down the spoon, leaving the cooking to give herself over to the exciting sensations that Ethan gave her body. The rest of her moan was drowned in his kiss. He grabbed her by the waist and turned her to face him, plunging her lips into a deep kiss. His tongue slid into her mouth, searching for his answer there. Their kiss was slow and exploring, rich in intimacy. He lifted her hips, and she wrapped her legs around him. He carried her to the nearest free surface, the sofa, and carefully placed her there. Her moan and movements drove him crazy with desire. "I love you so much, Zoe." Zoe quickly undid the buttons on her shirt and took off her bra. Her round breasts were exposed to him. Ethan Cole woke up. He was surrounded by darkness. He looked at his watch. Bright LEDs on the board showed that there were still several hours left until the morning. His mind was still in a fog from sleep. His tongue seemed to remember the taste of Zoe. And then everything suddenly washed over him like a bucket of ice water. The drowsiness instantly passed, and the gloomy reality overtook him again. How many days had it been since he had seen them? He tried to remember. He looked to the side and saw Zoe sleeping peacefully next to him. Her lips lifted slightly into a smile, and her right arm was casually draped across his body. Did you dream about her too? Did she dream about him? Or perhaps she was dreaming. Ethan carefully climbed out of bed, trying not to wake her. He went to his closet and opened it. He took the pendant out of his jacket and opened it. They looked so happy in these photos. Lie. Everything is a lie. He will never return to her the way he did in his dream. Ethan walked into the lobby of the Peninsula Hotel. His eyes scanned the weekend crowd, and he found the right man leaning on a pillar in the right corner. He approached her, his body barely able to cope with the exhaustion caused by the sleepless nights he had endured waiting for this moment. "Where are they?" he said with difficulty. "In the penthouse," Sophie answered. "They stopped by a few hours ago. The concierge was kind enough to give me a key card for a small fee." He took the card and put it in his pocket. Sophie tilted her head, studying his expression. Her gaze became serious. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Ethan sighed bitterly. "I really don't know." "Wait," she said calmly. She searched for him with professional dexterity. He looked at her in surprise, to which she just shrugged. "I need to make sure you don't have a weapon. I don't want to be an accomplice to murder." "I'll go," Ethan muttered. "The bill will arrive tomorrow." They separated. Ethan walked as if in a trance. His feet automatically carried him towards the elevator. Several friendly strangers cast curious glances at him as he took his place in the corner of the booth. His gaze was fixed on the digital board, mercilessly counting down the floors. His heart was already burning, and he prayed that there were infinitely many floors so that he would not meet Zoe. But alas, the elevator soon reached the top floor. Without a clear plan of action, his feet carried him forward until he stopped in front of the massive double doors leading to the suite. A "Do Not Disturb" sign hung on the doorknob, as if warning him not to enter. Of course, he inserted the key card into the lock and opened the door. A narrow corridor with a clothes hanger led to a spacious living room. Ethan saw the same man from the restaurant. He came out of the refrigerator, holding a bottle of wine in his hands. He froze in place when he saw the uninvited guest. "Damn it, are you knocking here at all?" His wife's lover spoke with a slight Eastern European accent. He was just under 6 feet tall and wore a casual flannel shirt and boxers. "Change the sheets in the bedroom and bring another bottle of Pinot Noir." Ethan remained where he was, his mind drowning out all sounds except the blood pounding in his ears. His fists clenched and his insides tightened. The stranger narrowed his eyes with suspicion. "What are you waiting for? Go and do it." "Who is this, Milos?" Zoya's voice sounded from the bedroom. Those 4 simple words hit Ethan's ears like a hammer. The voice was unmistakably hers, the same gentle, melodic voice that he had heard so many times on the phone when he called her from the hospital. And now that voice was calling for someone else. "Probably cleaning, I'll sort it out," Milos answered, turning his head towards the bedroom. "Come on, Milos." "Get rid of him and come back," Zoe said, leaving the bedroom wearing only a loose shirt that barely reached her knees. She froze in place when she saw their guest. It could be seconds, minutes, or even hours. Ethan didn't know how long he stood motionless in the hallway, looking at his beautiful, half-naked wife and the man she was intimate with. "Darling, maybe we should still let him change the sheets," Milos said, not understanding what was happening. Zoe's eyes widened in horror, her lips trembling. making incoherent sounds before she could squeeze out a meaningful phrase. "He's not cleaning Milo's. This is my husband." "Husband?" Milo's asked, beginning to realize what was happening. Ethan was finally able to speak. "Hello, Zoe. I see you found a replacement for your overtime." "Ethan, honey, I'm so sorry you found out about it this way. I swear I didn't mean to hurt you." "Don't," he shouted. "Just don't." "Ethan, please. It's not what you think. I still love you. You have to believe me." "Should I believe you? Do you want me to believe you after what I just saw? We'll talk about this later when I get home. I promise I'll tell you everything you want to know." In 3 quick strides, Ethan crossed the room and delivered a powerful blow to Milo's stomach, knocking him to his knees. Zoe screamed and grabbed her head in horror. "There's nothing more to talk about, Zoe. I loved you, and you threw away everything we built for this man. It's over between us." Before she could respond, Ethan walked out of the room without looking back. The elevator, the lobby, the street, all of it became just a blurry memory as he returned to the apartment to meet with an old friend named Jack Daniels. Now he sought the solace in the bottle that he had once found in his wife. Zoe returned late in the evening. She spent the entire subway ride trying to regain her composure and searching for words to explain what Ethan had seen. Endless rehearsals and repetitions in her head did not help to find at least one scenario that would not end in tears. With every step that brought her closer to the door they once called home, she became more and more afraid. Almost everything in her rotted from the knowledge of what she had done. She inserted the key into the lock and opened the door to see her husband sitting in the living room with an almost empty bottle in his lap. This sight had already become familiar to her over the past few days, but she could not guess the real reason for this behavior. Recycling was a convenient excuse her brain came up with, not daring to think of another option. But now the truth has become obvious. She entered the living room, feeling only the pain of the destruction of their marriage. "Ethan," she whispered. Her husband sat in front of her with empty eyes and a thin, haggard face. He was no longer the man she knew. "How long did this last?" he asked without raising his head. "About 6 months," she answered honestly. Honesty was the least she could do to repay him now. "Why? Where did we go wrong? Ethan, please listen to me." Zoe sat down on the floor next to him and leaned against the wall. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. "I was only 3 years old when my parents moved from New York to Greenville. Dad was an investment banker who lost his job. They moved out of town to cut costs. The small town was all I knew." Ethan shook the empty bottle with a blank expression, as if hoping there was at least a drop left in it. Zoe took a deep breath and continued. "My father told me many stories before bed about his life in the city, about how many cars he had, about expensive hotels and high society. It seemed like a fairy tale to me, the dream I wanted most. When you said you were moving to the city, I was delighted. It was a chance to be closer to everything my dad told me. I lived, loved, and fought next to you, hoping that one day we would become rich. Ethan, more than anything, I wanted you to be part of my fairy tale." She paused for a moment, wiping a tear from her face. "You worked so hard. I understood this, honestly, but it did not reduce loneliness. I knew that you did all this for our sake." "So you decided to cheat on me?" he asked bitterly. "Of course not," she exclaimed. "This thought never even occurred to me. One day Milo's came as a patient. He had a minor operation, and I was the nurse who took care of him. He was so sweet and charming that I became close to him. We talked about everything under the sun. Conversations. Did you crush my heart by talking? Why didn't you talk to me? Because you weren't there," she blurted out. The words hung in the air between them. Her manner finally cracked, and she burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, Ethan, but you were never there, but he was. I was vulnerable, and he took advantage of it. He had everything that Dad told me about in his fairy tales. When I was with him, I became a little girl again." Finally, making sure there was nothing left in the bottle, Ethan let it go, and it rolled across the carpet. "I worked so we could have a house, so we could send our kids to college. That's why I wasn't there. working night after night, putting in overtime to give you the life you want. I know, and I love you for it. I swear on everything that is sacred to me, I still love you with all my heart. But I'm not in love with you anymore. These words hit him like a sharp dagger, pierced his heart. His brain, like an echo, repeated them over and over again. This couldn't happen. It just couldn't. The girl with whom he spent his entire life, to whom he devoted himself, now belonged to someone else. I won't fight for anything in a divorce. I don't want to hurt you anymore. Ethan felt completely empty. He covered his face with his hands, clutching his hair with his fingers and crying bitterly. Zoe immediately hugged him by the shoulders and kissed his head. His body shook with sobs, and she pressed her cheek to his, letting their tears mingle. The bandage was torn off, and the wound was bleeding. I still can't understand it. It's over. Ethan looked at the ceiling. The street lights outside cast long shadows on the walls. 2 days had already passed, but his mind still could not process what had happened. Sometimes I think it's just a nightmare. Well, if this is a dream, then it's not so bad, answered a voice next to his body. He looked down and saw Sophie Montoya kiss his stomach. Her magnificent curves were clearly visible in the semi-darkness, and of course, she was completely naked. Ethan grinned as he felt experienced lips pepper his torso with kisses. Her tongue slid over his navel, and she continued to kiss his chest, gradually moving towards his neck. You surprised me with your self-control. I thought you were going to explode at her, but you didn't. I grew up in a family where my father used force against me, my mother and my sister, Ethan said, stroking her hair. It taught me never to lay a hand on a woman or child, no matter what happens. Have you even thought that one day this might happen? She asked, sitting up and leaning on her elbow so she could see his face. I didn't even imagine such an outcome. Reality sometimes brings surprises, Sophie answered thoughtfully. She stopped what she was doing for a minute and looked into his eyes. He carefully watched her movements, unable to tear himself away from her naked body. It all seemed so surreal, seeing another woman in bed next to you. Parts of his mind still refused to accept what was happening. Let me tell you a story, she began, smiling slightly. Several years ago, I received a contract from De Beers. They needed to find the man who stole a very expensive diamond from their mines. They thought he was somewhere in my area. I used all my resources and strength, but did not find a single trace. For months, not a single clue. And then one day, a man from Philadelphia calls me and says that he wants to voluntarily surrender for stealing a diamond. Did he just give up? Ethan asked, running his hand over her chest. Yes, she grinned. It turned out that he stole the diamond to make an engagement ring out of it. He carried him halfway around the world, and when he returned, he found that the woman he loved was already engaged to someone else. I didn't have the slightest evidence against him, but he confessed himself. Wow. Enough chatting, the private detective answered with a smile. Let's celebrate your newfound freedom. With that, she started giving pleasure again, and then they started having sex. Soon they were both breathing heavily, lying next to each other, damp from sweat and effort, merging into one. Zoe is lucky to have you with her, Sophie said thoughtfully, leaning back on the pillow and looking at him. I don't know, Ethan muttered. Okay, I have to get ready, Sophie said, getting out of bed and looking for her things scattered around the room. See you at work tomorrow. Remember, don't say a word about this to anyone. I don't want a meeting with HR about office romances. I understand, Ethan smiled. This never happened. Well done, she winked, buttoning up her jeans. For the first time in a long time, you have the opportunity to explore new horizons. You've had a rough time. Now have some fun. She put on the rest of her clothes and walked to the window, lighting a Camel cigarette. What happened to the thief who stole the diamond? Ethan asked, looking at her. He hanged himself in prison, she answered, thoughtfully exhaling a cloud of smoke. In his suicide note, he wrote that he could not survive the pain. She looked at Ethan with slight concern. Should I worry about you? She asked directly. Don't worry, I'm not in jail. But the pendant in his box with 2 faces from the past said otherwise. he ended up in another prison. The divorce was as quick and painless as it could have been. There were no children. Each of them had their own bank account. Zoe received an apartment until the end of the current lease term in lieu of alimony. And now, it's all over. 10 years of joys and sorrows were washed away with one court decision and 2 signatures. Throughout the entire procedure, Zoe could not bring herself to look Ethan in the eyes. Ethan moved into a one-room apartment at the hospital. It was Spartan, reminiscent of his first home in the city, but that was enough for him. One of the eternal cruelties of life is that it goes on. Ethan threw himself into his work. He took overtime whenever he could, spending weeks in the hospital. Every time he had an extra shift, he signed up to volunteer. Every time there was a gap in the night duty schedule, he raised his hand. Why not? The hospital couldn't be worse than a small, empty apartment. Finally, his boss had to almost forcefully remove him from the hospital grounds. Despite his vehement protests, everyone agreed that he needed a break. He wandered the streets, looking at coffee shops, cinemas, and galleries, each of which brought back touching memories of Zoe. Images of their marriage floated into his subconscious. The park bench where she waited for him when he was late. A food truck that made her favorite quesadillas even at 4 a.m. The jewelry store where he once surprised her with sapphire earrings for her birthday. St. Catherine Park, where they walked holding hands in the moonlight. His attention was drawn to an unusual bar on East 72nd Street. It had a bright green facade overlooking the street. A neon sign reading Jade Bar flickered above the entrance. Curiosity got the better of him, and he went inside. There were few people inside, mostly in groups of 3 or 4. It was a motley group from noisy students to mature ladies at a bachelorette party. Ethan sat down on an overstuffed bar stool and soon caught the attention of the friendly Chinese-American girl behind the counter. She was in her early 20s. "Hi, I'm Jade." "Jade? Like at the Jade Bar?" "I know, not very original," she laughed. "Do you like it?" "The bar definitely fits the theme," Ethan noted, looking around the tastefully decorated interior. Most of the walls were covered in bright green panels, and small jade figurines stood next to the seating areas. "Thank you, kind sir," Jade bowed playfully. "Well, what should I pour you?" "Whiskey without ice. As tight as possible." "Tough day, huh?" she said, pouring the amber liquid into 2 glasses. "Can I ask what happened?" Ethan raised his hand again, this time showing a light strip of skin where his wedding ring had been. "Sorry. How long ago did this happen?" "A few months ago," he replied, taking a sip. "What went wrong?" "I don't know," he sighed. "I would like to know, but I don't know." "Cheer up," Jade insisted, placing her hand on his shoulder. "This is of little use. You are alone again. I'm sure the women are already lined up. We haven't had time to do this yet." "Oh, this is sad," she grimaced. "Well, the good news is that there are at least 3 people already watching you, and they all want to fix this situation." "What are they?" he muttered, not even bothering to turn around. Jade said, pursing her lips thoughtfully. "I see one girl who is celebrating the last evening of freedom before marriage. She's already looked at you twice." "Pass. Who's next?" "Well, there's a group of older ladies sitting 10 o'clock from me. It seems like 4 of them have already drunk too many daiquiris and are nudging the 5th one to come over to you." "You're kidding," Ethan said, taking a quick glance behind him for good measure. "God, this lady is older than my mother. Now she looks like this. Imagine what she will look like without makeup in the morning." He hurriedly took another sip. "Who's behind door number 3? "Wait," the barmaid said, craning her neck to see better. "This is weird. There's a couple sitting at the far end of the bar. The husband has been pushing his wife and pointing in your direction for several minutes now. She looks interested too." "What?" "I'm sure they will invite you to have sex with his wife, and your husband will watch," Jade said confidently. "Do people really do this? I see this often here. I thought this only happens in stories on a sex site." "Well," Jade smiled widely, "I have to disappoint you, but you're in one of those stories. So, will you accept their offer?" "No, thank you," Ethan said, draining the glass in one gulp. How about another portion? I don't think so. She put the bottle aside. Are you cutting me off? Am I that drunk? Almost, she smiled. But if I'm going to take you home tonight, I'd rather you weren't half drunk. Ethan looked at her with a slight smile. She leaned over and whispered in his ear, I close in 45 minutes. He lazily tapped the counter until there were fewer people around him. Waiters and security guards kicked out overly drunk patrons and put them in taxis. The married couple went to another bar in search of their gaming partner. Jade helped her staff stack chairs and tables before handing each of them a roll of money for the day. Well, where did we stop? Oh yes, this is the part where I take you to my place and have sex with you until you forget about your ex-wife. They jumped into one of the last remaining taxis and drove to Jade's house. In the car, there were many awkward attempts to unbutton the top buttons of her shirt, but Ethan gave in, unable to cope with it in his drunken state. Jade pulled him out of the car and dragged him to her apartment. The details were lost in his drunken mind. He staggered and fell, laughing for no reason. Since Jade was the more sober of the two, she took the lead. She laid him on the bed and easily took off his shirt and trousers. Her eyes took in his smooth skin, and she licked her lips in anticipation. Jade gently ran her fingers down Ethan's neck, slowly moving down to his chest. Her lips touched his skin, leaving barely perceptible kisses, causing Ethan to sigh softly. He was immersed in his thoughts, his gaze directed somewhere into the distance, as if memories from the past occupied his mind. Jade took her time, her touches were soft, and her fingers drew circles on his skin. She paused for a moment, looking at Ethan, who, although physically nearby, was mentally somewhere far away. That didn't stop her. She kissed him, trying to get his attention. Ethan finally returned to reality, watching her movements but still remaining distant. Jade continued to touch his lips and cheeks, trying to bring him back to the present. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was a spark between them, but soon Ethan was lost in his thoughts again. There was silence in the room, broken only by the light sounds of their breathing. Jade tried to create a moment of intimacy, but realized that Ethan remained distant. However, she remained close, giving him space to sort out his thoughts, while she continued to gently touch his face and hands, trying to create an atmosphere of warmth and understanding. Sweaty and panting, Jade collapsed onto her lover. Ethan looked at her and kissed her cheek. Seriously, is this all I get? Ethan turned on his side and pulled her towards him, peppering her with kisses along her cheek and jawline. Finally, he reached her lips and kissed her deeply. That's better, she said, settling comfortably next to him. I immediately realized that your thoughts were not here. Sorry, he apologized. I drank too much. And little time passed after the divorce. That too, he admitted. You seem like a nice guy, Jade said, stroking his face. I can't imagine why your wife left you. She noticed the pained expression on his face and knew she had struck a nerve. Divorced guys often come to my bar. They are all similar in that they have either already moved on or want to do so. Did you help them all move on? No, you're special, honey. First of all, you didn't try to hit on me as soon as you sat down. It's hard to move on, he sighed. It's like admitting that the last 10 years of my life have been nothing more than a great lie. 10 years in which I loved my wife more than anything in the world. I'm still having a hard time accepting that it's really over. I can almost hear my father and sister saying, "We told you so." Jade took his hand and kissed the back of his hand. Look around. People have really serious problems. Can you imagine what the world would look like if everyone lived their lives buried in their past mistakes? Moving forward is part of the healing process. You have to accept this. Ethan considered his last words. As a doctor, he understood better than others how bad things could get for people. Jade was silent for a few seconds before speaking again. You have two options, my friend. You can either move on with your life or wallow in your misery forever. I'm sure you understand which of these options sounds better. You're the third person to tell me this. And not in vain. Well, how about I make us some coffee? and we can talk some more. I also know the number for a support group for divorced people. I have given it to many of my clients. Cool. Jade sat up, looking at the still naked man and licking her lips. Someday I'd like to take revenge when you're in better shape. You seem to be an incorrigible optimist, Ethan said. Hopeless, she confirmed. She then attached the prosthesis to her right leg and secured it securely. After making sure everything was in order, she got up to make coffee. Thank you for your story, Ethan, the bearded man said. Ethan looked around the small group of people from behind the podium. It was a good cross-section of society of different races and genders. Most of the cheerleaders were in their 40s, but there were a few who were younger than him. He waved awkwardly to the audience and returned to his seat in the last row. Who else wants to share? Asked the bearded man. A hand shot up. Everyone present watched as a fat, balding man in sweatpants and a t-shirt that barely fit him stood up and began to talk about his misfortunes. He started his story with how his wife constantly humiliated and offended him. Then came a tearful description of how he found her in their marital bed with her boss, and she turned out to be completely shameless. The boss, it turned out, was just one of many men his wife brought into their marital bed. She presented him with a choice: accept the current state of affairs, where lovers can mock him for his insolvency, or suffer financial ruin in the event of a divorce. He endured the first for more than a year, but in the end, she divorced him anyway. The story held Ethan's attention for only a few minutes. He quickly looked around the group and noticed that many were engrossed in their smartphones or tablets, completely ignoring the man's crying as if it were in the background, like the sound of a vacuum cleaner running. A complete waste of time, he muttered, checking his watch. I agree, said a voice nearby. He turned and saw a red-haired woman, equally indifferent to the monologue unfolding ahead. She was of average height, of a slight build, and with expressive features. You're the only one here who said something that didn't make me sick. Glad to hear that. Linda Harness, she introduced herself, holding out her hand. Although perhaps it's time to become Linda DeFazio again. So what happened to you? He asked. Student romance with a teacher. You know this type. Ethan stroked his chin thoughtfully. She made herself comfortable on the folding chair and continued. I should have guessed. After all, he cheated with me while he was married to his third wife. I was fourth on his list, and undoubtedly, while we were married, he was already having an affair with his future fifth wife. It's horrible. It is the way it is, she sighed. He didn't even try to pretend that I was the only one for him, but I had to be so for him. He is a real tyrant. The one who marries him next can only be pitied. I hope that at least the divorce agreement was good. Hardly, she laughed. He is a famous lawyer. Made me sign a rock-solid prenuptial agreement and a confidentiality agreement before the wedding. This should have been my first warning. I'm very sorry that this happened. Me too, Linda said, tossing her red hair. When you spoke in front of everyone and said that you still loved your ex-wife, I understood you. Despite everything he's done, I still love him just as much as I did 3 years ago. I loved him enough to tolerate his twisted role plays and disgusting fantasies, but he found someone who could love them even more. Ethan looked around and saw that no one sitting next to them was paying attention to them. The meeting was divided into several separate groups, and the bearded leader only dreamed of quickly going home and taking a Xanax before bed. Would you like me to tell you about one of these games? One of his role-playing fantasies? You don't need to tell me this, he said softly. It's hard enough as it is. There's no need to go through everything again. Everything is fine. In fact, it's for the better. My therapist says I need to open up and tell people I can trust about what happened to me, and I feel like I can trust you. You just met me. Let's call it a leap of faith. I have faith that you will not abuse what I am about to tell you. He nodded, although he wasn't sure he was ready to hear what came next. He wanted me to dress like a prostitute and stand on a street corner in Harlem. He let me know that he would be watching me from afar. The real easy to get girls lined up, some of them studying me curiously. Every car that passed, every lustful old man who proposed to me. I felt dirty and worthless, but I had to play my part by letting them grope me. I had to do everything except go home with them. He was very strict about this. Finally, when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he pulled up in his Rolls-Royce. He came out and offered me a wad of bills in front of all the other easily accessible girls. I played my part and got into the car with him, even when the others started whispering to each other. It was only when I was in his car that I noticed that his friends were sitting in the back seat. "That's enough," Ethan said, raising his hand. "I've heard enough. Please, no more." Linda fell silent. The meeting was finally coming to an end. "My therapist says that I have problems with my father. He thinks that such meetings will help me deal with my mistakes, but it doesn't work. Something else helps me." "What exactly?" "Come with me, I'll show you." Linda led him out of the building. They took the subway to the outskirts of the Bronx and went outside. She took his hand and led him past the graffiti on the walls and the dirty streets until they came to an abandoned warehouse. There were dim reflections of light coming from inside. With growing anxiety, he followed her inside and immediately found himself in the thick of the crowd, deafened by the blaring music and flashing lights. The black light flickered, creating chaos among the glow sticks and bracelets. Silhouettes of people dancing twerk rubbed around him. "Relax," Linda said playfully, dancing next to him. Ethan felt less and less comfortable by the minute. In the far corner, he could barely make out the outlines of two women kissing. "Come on, dance, Ethan," she said capriciously. "I think it's better for me to leave." "Nonsense. I'll show you where the real party is." They went into another room. This one was brighter. At every step one could see faces with gothic makeup and outdated hairstyles. All the heavily tattooed and pierced faces turned to look at the new arrival. Ethan felt as out of place as possible. "Is this your new friend, Linda?" "This is Ethan." They sat down on what might once have been a bed. Linda kissed him on the lips, pushing her tongue deep inside. Ethan tried to free himself for several seconds and eventually succeeded. Linda looked at him in bewilderment. "What's wrong with you?" "I'm just trying to be kind. I really need to leave." Suddenly, the two more sober members of the group grabbed his arm and pinned him to the bed. Ethan tried to break free, but was soon grabbed by two more. He looked at them in horror, and his fear intensified when he saw Linda holding a syringe with a maniacal smile on her face. "SHHH," she whispered in his ear. "Don't resist. Don't resist necessity. We've all suffered enough. When I heard your story today, I knew I had to help you. Everything will be fine. Say goodbye to your pain," she said joyfully, sticking the needle. It was a cold winter morning. The windows were covered with frost, and the last logs of the night were crackling in the fireplace. Daylight was shining through the skylight, and its warm rays were reaching towards the large four-poster bed. Ethan pulled off the thick blanket. The plush mattress literally absorbed him in its warmth. He turned on his side and saw Zoe's head peeking out from under the blanket. She smiled in her sleep, her fair skin and chestnut curls illuminated by the sun's rays. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Zoe fidgeted sweetly, grabbed his hand and brought it to her lips, kissing each finger in turn. "Good morning, dear." "Good morning," she muttered sleepily. "Let's go see the view." "I like the view here too," she grumbled, turning to kiss Ethan's face and neck. They kissed long and tenderly. Despite her protests, he lifted her from the bed and carried her to the wooden balcony. She rose to her feet and gasped as she saw the snow-capped peaks turn a dazzling yellow in the morning sun. The cold air of Vale enveloped them in a damp grip. "I'm delighted," she squealed, like an excited child, and jumped into his arms. The impact sent Ethan falling onto the hard wooden floor, and Zoe kissed him again. "Happy anniversary, Zoe." The warm rays of the sun gradually dissipated the fog in his mind. The forest house on the snow-covered mountain dissolved, giving way to a damp, destroyed warehouse. Ethan felt his body and did not find any clothes on himself. He shook his head, trying to shake off the remnants of his trance. There were bodies around him. He felt skin underneath him. He looked down and saw Linda DeFazio lying on the cold floor with her red hair spread out. Her glassy eyes looked at the ceiling, and her hand lay limply on the floor. Instinctively, Ethan felt her neck to check for a pulse. There was no pulse. Linda DeFazio is finally free of her demons. She would no longer have to submit to the perverted whims of any man where she was now. Ethan felt nauseous. His stomach felt like it was filled with lead, and the room began to spin and tilt in front of him. He struggled to his feet and leaned against the wall. My head ached as if it had been hit with a hammer. Taking a few deep breaths, he tried to come to his senses and looked around. There were other bodies around him. Some of them barely moved, others lay motionless. Ethan checked the pulses of several people, finding them alive. He saw a pile of abandoned clothes against the wall and began to rummage through them. Some of the bodies had serious wounds from needles and sharp objects that tore the skin, and he provided first aid using improvised tourniquets. Finally, he found his clothes and mobile phone. It was late afternoon when he finished giving his statement to detectives and was examined by medical staff. According to him, it was a new street mixture of a banned substance with lethal side effects. He was lucky to survive. Ethan walked out of the building, staggering. The sun was too bright, and he covered his eyes with his hand. He sat down on a bench near the embankment, covered his face with his hands, and began to cry. Nothing else mattered to Ethan. He hit rock bottom. Tears ran down his hands and dripped onto his forearms. Passers-by glanced at him, but he did not stop crying. These were tears that had been accumulating for a long time. Tears that were poisonous. Finally, he allowed the poison to come out. He took out his phone and made a call. Several rings passed before a surprised voice answered on the other end of the line. "Val, you were right. Hurt." Finally, he accepted the need to move on. The next few weeks became a time of sobriety and awareness for Ethan. He made a conscious decision to end his post-divorce streak of casual affairs and self-destruction. He had reached the lowest level of his life. The only way was up, and he was going to follow it. "Another case has arrived," said one of the senior doctors, handing Ethan a folder. Ethan groaned. Another child swallowed a coin. It was his third of the day. If parents were more careful about what their children put in their mouths, the emergency room wouldn't be so crowded. He gave a few brief instructions to the nurse and sent the child with her. Ethan loved his job, except for the weekly emergency room duties. Of course, sometimes there were real accidents where he could make a difference, but most often it was weeping wounds and tending to sprains. Grumbling, he went to the next patient behind the curtain. He pushed it aside and saw an equally bored patient. "So, what's wrong with you?" he asked. "Nothing," the girl replied sarcastically, her dirty blonde hair hiding one side of her face. "Nothing. Do you need to repeat it twice for you to understand? I thought doctors were smart." "Who brought her?" Ethan asked as he stepped out from behind the curtain. The young paramedic quickly ran up with a folder. She tried to jump from the roof of an apartment complex. One of the residents managed to grab her in time. "Nothing serious, just a couple of cuts and bruises, but we need to keep her for a psychiatric evaluation." "I didn't try to jump from the roof, idiot," came the voice from behind the curtain. "I'll deal with her," Ethan said. He took the folder and returned to the room. "So, Miss Pendergast," he read from the first page. "Do you like standing on the edge of the roof for the sake of the view?" "Yes," she shouted irritably. "I was looking for a good angle to take a bird's-eye view when this stupid well-wisher pulled me back. For a photo." "Wait," she said, pulling out a large bag from under the bed. She unfastened it and took out a cool camera and a set of lenses. "Are you satisfied now? Are you a photographer?" "On better days, yes. You know what? Go to the waiting room and bring me the latest magazine you have." Out of curiosity, Ethan went and fetched the latest issue of Time magazine from the shelf in the waiting room. His patient flipped through several pages before reaching a double-page spread that showed a photograph of the aftermath of the shelling in Gaza. She smiled and pointed to the tiny signature in the corner. "Samantha Pendergast. Yourself, if you want to get to know me better." "Are you filming for Time?" "I'm actually a freelancer, but I've submitted materials to Time, National Geographic, and even some decent newspapers. They call me when they need something memorable. Ethan sat down next to her and lingered for a moment in the photo. It was almost artistic, the way the smoke rose from the ruins. Admit it, you thought I was just another crazy woman with a camera, right? Maybe a little. Ethan smiled sheepishly as he briefly scanned her file. Okay, he said, standing up and straightening his robe. I think you're free. I don't see any problems with you. It's a pity that I can't say the same, Sam answered. I'm sorry. You know, photographers, at least good ones, are very observant. Most of my photography takes days, even weeks, of waiting until I capture the perfect moment. I can tell everything about a person by looking at him. The more you try to hide your weakness, the more you become an open book. Ethan paused for a moment. She grinned mockingly. You have a strip of light skin on your finger from a wedding ring. Your clothes are not old, but they are 2 sizes too big. You've lost a lot of weight recently. The most noticeable thing is your eyes. From the moment you pulled back the curtain until now, the only time there had been a spark was during our conversation. You haven't been sleeping well for a long time, have you? What are you, my psychologist? No, she smiled. Your friend, if you please. Look, I'm sorry you were dragged here for no reason, but I think. Ethan was abruptly interrupted by Sam's camera. She proudly looked at the photo she took on the digital screen. Look, she suggested, turning it towards him. Ethan just waved it off. This is my blank canvas now. I'm going to make you look a lot better, and then we'll take another photo, something like before and after. I'm flattered by your enthusiasm, but I'm not in a state to. For other relationships, she finished for him. Me too. Nobody said we couldn't be friends. He gave in, which delighted her. Great. I have an extra ticket to the launch of Neil deGrasse Tyson's new book at the Strand this Saturday. More precisely, no, but I'll get it. Ethan looked at her in complete bewilderment while she calmly made his plans for the weekend. Sam saw his confusion and burst out laughing. If you think I'm special, wait until you get to know me better. How do you like it? Now I'm even more confused about black holes than I was after watching Interstellar, Ethan said. He and Sam were walking along Fifth Avenue. Ethan put his hands in his pockets to protect them from the cold air. Sam was wearing a scarf wrapped around her neck and a sweatshirt from the Rhode Island School of Design. But you must admit, it's exciting. The thought of what could be there is so far away that no one will ever see. Ethan's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and rejected the call. Sam noticed this, but decided not to interfere. I looked up information about you, he said. You didn't mention the Pulitzer Prize. I'm flattered, she smiled. They reached Washington Square Park. The sidewalks were dotted with street performers, from spontaneous artists to jugglers and musicians. Sam laughed and handed out tips to everyone she passed. Ethan stopped to admire a pair of mimes skillfully enacting the scene. Don't let the situation fool you. There are some truly talented people here. A painting for a couple, suggested the cheerful young artist. Actually, we're just... Why not? Sam interrupted, giving him a stern look. She dragged Ethan toward the brush, while the artist set up her easel and palette. A little to the right. Now hug her. That's better, exclaimed the energetic girl with a ponytail and got to work. While we wait, why don't you tell me about yourself? Sam suggested. Shouldn't a real photographer be able to guess for himself? He joked. Her dissatisfied look immediately stopped this. Ethan paused and finally began to speak. Born and raised in Greenville, a town in the northern part of the state. Immediately after school, I moved here with Zoe. I went to pre-med at New York University on a scholarship, and now, 10 years later, here I am. This is the shortest and most boring biography I have ever heard. What about you? My father is Irish. My mother's family includes Germans, French, and Spaniards. Essentially, I am half of Europe rolled into one. Born and raised here in New York. And now home is where my camera takes me. They paused their conversation for a moment to strike a pose suitable for the artist. The chirping of cicadas was heard in the air, and the birds returned to their nests. The road was filled with the usual noise of traffic. Everything is ready, the artist announced. The couple came to look at their image on the canvas. The painting was incredibly detailed, highlighting every curve of skin and contour of muscle against the evening light. Sam's portrait had a big smile on her face, while Ethan's seemed rather awkward. Sam paid the artist generously for an honest image. A few days later, Sam insisted that Ethan go with her to the Gagosian Gallery, where her friend's work was exhibited. He arrived at her loft in Soho, not quite knowing what awaited him. Ethan rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later, an unshaven man in a fedora opened the door. "Sam is waiting for you. By the way, my name is Damien." Ethan shook hands with his new acquaintance. Damien preferred bright colors and wore red, green, and blue at the same time in the most saturated shades. Just looking at him for a long time could cause a headache. Ethan followed him through a hallway whose walls were decorated with an eclectic selection of paintings and photographs. In several of them, Sam was the central figure in a group of people. "She talks a lot about you, a lot," Damien continued. The last door on the right led to Sam's studio. Damien opened the door and motioned for Ethan to come inside. For the first time, Ethan saw Sam at work. Her light brown hair was neatly combed and parted on the sides of her face. She was wearing a tight t-shirt and jeans. The camera strap hung around her neck, and she focused intently on the settings on the back panel. "Sam, you have a visitor." She looked up from the camera and smiled widely. "I see you've already met Damien. He is also a photographer, by the way. He mainly shoots fashion. This is exactly what I had in mind when I spoke about the fruit with a camera earlier." "Ha ha, this never gets old," Damien grimaced, throwing his hat on the bed. Ethan looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The studio was full of bright images and colors. Overcoming his disorientation, he asked, "So you and him are dating?" "God forbid," Damien laughed. "She's not my type." "A pleasant face is not to your taste," Ethan joked in response. "Nice face, yes," Damien said bluntly, "but not hers. But I would put you to bed without question." Damien turned to Sam with a satisfied smile stretching from ear to ear. "Give me one night and I'll turn you over." Sam burst out laughing again, as did Damien. They laughed, supporting each other, until Ethan turned red to the tips of his ears. "Damien is between relationships now, so he lives with me," Sam explained. "He's my best friend and a walking stereotype of a fashion photographer." "Sorry for the unexpected turn," Damien said, straightening up. "I hope my gayness doesn't bother you." "Not at all," Ethan answered quickly. "My sister is also gay. I'll have to get to know her sometime." Ethan smiled faintly, unsure if he shared that desire. "So you're sure you don't like men?" Damien asked, looking a little sad as Ethan shook his head. "Even a little. Wow, I haven't seen you this upset since we watched Red Wedding," Sam grinned, zipping her camera into her bag. "Let's go, Ethan. It's time for us." "It was nice meeting you, Damien." Mutually. "Let me know when you're ready for a change of scenery." "And by change of scenery, do you mean a night of good, hard sex, of course," Damien said with frightening calm. Ethan practically ran the last few steps to get out of Sam's loft. "Don't let Damien get to you. He's actually a very nice guy." The Gagosian Gallery was full of top-notch artists, even top-notch critics, and random guests. No matter how hard Ethan tried, he couldn't see anything special about the onyx sculptures of huge faces, but they received rave reviews from everyone present. "Ethan, Ethan, meet Alexei, the man behind the art," Sam exclaimed, dragging an anorexic man with a cane behind her. As always, Sam had an overwhelming sense of enthusiasm. "So you're that same Ethan," Alexei remarked, shaking his hand. "Blink twice if you are here against your will." They laughed and exchanged pleasantries. Alexei gave them a brief explanation of his work and then went in search of his agent. "Let me know when you start dying of boredom," Sam whispered in Ethan's ear. About an hour later, they were already on the subway. Ethan's phone rang again, and he thought for a moment before rejecting the call again. Sam noticed this, and her mood became depressed for a moment. Ethan patted her on the shoulder. penny for your thoughts. Nothing like that, just pseudo-philosophical nonsense. Try me. I'm a good listener. You mentioned my Pulitzer Prize. Have you seen the photo for which I received it? Photos of boys from Africa? Yes, I remember. They had just been released from the diamond mine. Not released, she added sadly. They were taken out of the mine only because they were old enough to understand the value of diamonds. They could be used for smuggling, so they were sent to the army to die there. It's horrible. But not for me, she said bitterly. My photograph of them being led out of the mine won me a Pulitzer as they marched toward their almost certain death as child soldiers. My reward is drenched in the blood of their childhood. There was silence between them for a few minutes before Sam sighed heavily. I often wonder, can the world be one big zero-sum game, where someone's happiness always comes at the expense of another? Is it possible for two people to create happiness out of nothing? Ethan scratched his chin thoughtfully. Just a few months ago, he would have been sure of the answer, or at least thought he knew it. I'm probably not the right person to ask such questions, he admitted. At the moment, I have a very biased attitude towards relationships. You're not the only one, she said so quietly that only Ethan heard her. She looked down and began fiddling with her camera strap again. So, are we still going to Lord's concert next week? Sam promised Ethan that she would become his friend. Her definition of friendship included going to see independent films, exploring new restaurants, and having fun going to see avant-garde theater productions. She was an incorrigible optimist, always trying to bring a smile to his face. Over the next few months, Ethan learned to smile again. His colleagues noticed that he no longer looked like an emaciated man who had survived famine. He returned to a normal work schedule as normal as possible with his fast-paced career. He became her constant companion at various parties. From rooftops on the Upper East Side to huge yachts on the Hudson, Ethan immersed himself in the crazy and eccentric world of art and journalism, with Sam as his guide. Finally, the day Ethan had been dreading had arrived. Sam invited him to a more private event. They dined at a Japanese fusion restaurant, and her request resulted in a significant amount of sake ending up on Ethan's pants. Do you want me to meet your family? God, you're talking about this like a colonoscopy, she laughed. I don't want anything from you. It's just that my parents are curious about who this guy is taking up all my time lately. It's my father's birthday. And how many people will there be? He blurted out, wiping a wet spot on his trousers with a nearby napkin. Only my parents and my brother's family. My brother is currently serving in Iraq, but his wife and daughter will be. These are the nicest people you will meet. I'll have to take your word for it, he muttered, desperately trying to save his trousers. He lowered his voice and asked, Don't you think this will give the wrong impression? No one will think that we are dating. How can you be so sure? Sam put down her fork and took a deep breath. For a moment, Ethan again saw the same depressed expression he had seen on the subway. Internally, he cursed himself for the lack of timing. Sorry, he quickly added. You don't need to explain anything. Thank you. I just have good reasons not to return to such relationships again. Before Ethan could apologize again, Sam gave him a familiar smile and asked the sommelier to bring a new bottle of sake. Stop acting like a girl. You look great. Ethan sat in a rental car a block from Samantha's brother's house, making sure his tuxedo fit just right. It was a pleasant house in Westchester on a quiet suburban street. Samantha finally convinced him that he looked decent. They walked to the door and rang the bell. 2 steps were heard, fast and light and the step of an adult. The door swung open, and standing in the threshold was a little girl who seemed to be no more than 3 years old. Aunt Sam, she screamed and jumped into Samantha's arms. She picked up her niece and began kissing her along the entire length and width of her face. Lana, it's been so long. You have become an even more charming princess than I remember. She put the girl on the floor, but continued to hug her tightly. A pleasant-looking brunette appeared. Lana, give your aunt a rest. Okay, everything's fine, Samantha affirmed, still holding her niece in her arms. And you must be Ethan, the woman said, holding out her hand. I'm Thalia, I'm sure I've already told you everything. Nice to meet you, he said, handing over a bottle of Chave Hermitage Blanc. Come on in, meet the others. Ethan followed her. The house was small, but carefully maintained. The walls led to the kitchen and dining room and were decorated with many photographs. He stopped in front of the central wall and noticed a photograph in an elaborate frame. It was a photo of Samantha, her niece, sister-in-law, and presumably her parents and brother. Her brother was dressed in military uniform with many awards and medals on his chest. Don't let his photo fool you. There's a funny guy behind all that military decor. Ethan turned around to see Samantha holding out her hand to him. He took her hand and she led him to the dining table, where there was a huge Belgian chocolate cake with countless candles. He greeted Samantha's parents. Despite their age, they looked surprisingly cheerful. Quickly, let me blow out the candles before Ethan can count them. There was laughter, and Samantha's father blew out all the candles in 3 attempts. He cut the cake into 4 pieces and fed it to 3 women who were waiting in line. Lana took the last piece and smeared it all over her face. Lana, sighed her disapproving mother. Before anyone could stop her, she took her daughter to the bathroom. So Samantha told us that you are a doctor, Samantha's father remarked. Yes, sir, he confirmed. I specialize in traumatology. Stop calling me sir, he laughed. It's already my birthday, don't make me older. Thalia returned with a tray full of light snacks. Samantha took the initiative and opened a bottle of wine, pouring it into 5 glasses. Do you work in the city? Samantha's mother asked. At New York Presbyterian. The other day I received an offer from Mount Sinai. There I will have more opportunities. That's worth a drink, Thalia said, and raised a toast. Do you have your own housing in the city? They say finding an apartment is hell. For now, only a small apartment near work. If I plan to invite you to visit, I'll have to find something better. That would be fun. Cookies and baked goods disappeared within minutes. Talia carefully went to replenish the tray. She sat down on the couch next to Ethan. James told me that this is his last tour. He has already found a job with a private security firm run by his former army friends. Everyone took another bite of food as little Lana climbed onto Samantha's lap. When will Dad return? He'll be back very soon, Lana, and this time for good. Lana clapped her hands and screamed with joy. Samantha lowered her head and kissed her all over her face again. Samantha is very close to her brother, Samantha's mother told Ethan. They were inseparable since childhood. There was not a single secret that one of them did not know about the other. Why don't we show him the recording? Suggested the father. Thalia nodded and took out the disc. This is a recording from 4 years ago. The TV screen came to life. The first scene is Samantha's parents whispering to each other. The camera moved to the courtyard where a large party was taking place. Thalia, visibly pregnant, poured drinks and chatted with her friends. The camera panned to Samantha, who was trying to focus on a squirrel sitting nearby. Then the camera cut back to Samantha's parents, who were gesturing towards her, and again to Samantha with her camera. Suddenly, a large man appeared in the frame and lifted her into the air, spinning her in his arms. Samantha screamed in joy before returning the hug. The guests at the party gasped and Thalia rushed to hug them. There was applause. Captain James Pendergast returned early from his tour. The camera captured his face, sandwiched between the identical smiles of Samantha and Thalia. Stop, Samantha said. They continued talking for several more hours. Ethan felt like he had known Samantha's parents all his life. Thalia was the perfect hostess, not letting him go more than 10 minutes without food. Samantha didn't let Lana go all this time. Aunt Sam, do you want to look at my new dress? Certainly. Maybe I'll even take a photo of you in it. Lana took Samantha's hand and led her into the room. The family watched them as they went upstairs. I'm glad Samantha is making friends again, Samantha's father said. She's so happy, almost like the old days before. Thalia began, but stopped in time, noticing that Ethan was not in the know. She hesitated and covered her mouth with her hand. Ethan looked around, noticing the confused faces around him. His brain was working feverishly before he said, "Whatever happened, you don't need to tell me if you feel uncomfortable." The three present looked at each other. "Samantha trusts you," her mother said quietly. "That's enough for me." Ethan's curiosity increased. He took a bite of the cookie and continued listening. "I just want you to know," Samantha's mother began, brushing away the first tears. "Samantha may look carefree and cheerful, but she suffers inside. She's been through hell, and we know it. Remember this always when you are with her. Even if she doesn't talk about it, she experiences it every night." "You really like her," Thalia added. "We thought she would never be able to trust a man again, but for your sake, she is trying to suppress her fears. Try not to offend her, okay? What happened to her?" Talia looked first at Samantha's mother, then at her father, and then back at Ethan, pursing her lips. Finally, she spoke. "Sorry, but I can't tell you this. She will never forgive me. Perhaps someday she will tell you everything herself." There was an awkward pause before Samantha returned with her niece and a stack of photographs. Everyone said their goodbyes, and Ethan led Samantha out. He looked at her, hiding the weight of the secret behind a calm smile. Suddenly, he hugged her tightly for no reason. She pulled back slightly and looked at him with a smile. "How much wine did you drink while I was away?" He just smiled and helped her into the car. They drove back to the city. Ethan came out outside his house. Rising to the roof, he began to look at the starry sky above him. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, seeing a familiar number that he didn't want to talk to. But his heart reached out to the bell. The whole day was dedicated to the importance of family, and it left a pleasant aftertaste. He answered. "You finally answered." "Hi, Val," he said. "It's a wonderful night, isn't it?" "Yes. You're so hard to get, Ethan. For the last 10 years, I've gotten one boring call on my birthday and Christmas, and that's it. You can imagine my surprise when you called them. It was a moment of weakness, Val. I just saw so many people die from drug overdoses. Then I realized that I had to move on. Do I need your moment of weakness so that you call me? It's sad, you know. How many times have I tried to call you since then? I know, but I'm sorry. I couldn't bring myself to answer." Valeria was silent for a moment. "Why?" she asked sincerely. "What did I do to deserve losing you?" "You know what?" he sighed heavily. "And you know I don't want to talk about it." "No," a voice sounded from the other end of the line with pressure. "This cold war between us has dragged on. Today it will end. Whatever you want to say, you tell me, and we will begin to repair our relationship. Not now, Val. I'm not ready. Now is the time. You're mad at me, I understand that. Scream, swear, throw out everything that has accumulated. I won't end this call until you do." "Please, Val," he said in a trembling voice. "Please don't. I want my little brother back, who was once my best friend, and damn it, I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan didn't say anything. Bitterness rose in his throat. "Everything you ever wanted to tell me, now is your chance. Don't keep it to yourself." He searched his mind for the right words to express the many feelings he was experiencing. There was a short pause before he began, slowly but with intensity. "Valeria Cole, you no longer have a brother. Never ever. Do you remember all those times your dad came home drunk and was about to hit you? I stood in his way until you locked yourself in your room, and he only hit me. Do you remember how I protected you? I remember. Do you remember how I stood up for you when you admitted to your mom and dad that you were gay? I remember." He paused to catch his breath. A few tears leaked through his defenses. 10 years of suppressed rage and frustration have finally reached their boiling point. All this burst out, regardless of his desire. "The one time I wanted you to stand up for me, the one time I needed your support, you weren't there. Dad told me not to marry Zoe, and you took his side. You said it was because we were too young, but in reality, it was because you didn't want to stand up to Dad." His voice began to shake, but he was determined to continue. "Mom couldn't protect me anymore, and I needed my older sister. I begged and cried for my big sister to be there, but she wasn't." He cried bitterly into the phone. Large tears flowed down his cheeks onto the concrete floor. His vision became too blurry to make out individual stars. "Are you finished?" Valeria asked softly. Ethan pressed the end call button and slowly walked back to his apartment. He would never admit it, but he felt lighter than he had in years. Mount Sinai is a world-renowned hospital. Ethan was in awe of what he saw: cutting-edge equipment, cutting-edge labs, and some of the best medical teams to learn from. Unfortunately, one thing that has remained the same is the need for weekly shifts in the emergency department. He stood in his white miracle worker uniform, deftly dodging yet another woman who claimed to have a skin disease down there that he simply had to feel. His phone rang, and he answered. "Hello, Sam. Yes, I'm almost done with the last patients in the ER. The film festival starts in 10 minutes, she answered irritably. Sorry. Take a seat for me, okay? I'll call you when I'm in Tribeca, and you can ask security to let me through." There was an irritated sigh, and the call ended. Ethan cursed from the bottom of his heart whoever came up with the shifts in the emergency room and headed to the next room behind the screen. So what? The words died in his throat. His legs felt weak, and his stomach felt like a sledgehammer had hit him. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His head began to spin, and he felt disorientated. Sitting on the bed, with a nasty bruise on her face and a bleeding lip, was the woman who had once been known as Zoe Morneau Cole. She looked up, opening her swollen eyes slightly to look at him. Ethan opened his medical file. He was determined to maintain professionalism. He was determined to show that she no longer had power over him. Mrs. Morneau. She decided to keep her maiden name. She smiled as much as her swollen lips would allow. "What happened to you, Mrs. Morneau?" The bathroom floor was wet, and I slipped. She hit her face on the edge of the bathtub. It was a stupid accident. Ethan knew that this was an obvious lie, but he continued to maintain forced professionalism. He carefully felt the damaged areas for pain. His fingers lingered a little longer on her lips. "Are you sure this happened in the bathroom?" "Yes," she insisted. "Please, it's not what you think." "Okay," he said. "It looks like you have a fractured cheekbone. The orderly will take you for an X-ray." Still maintaining his cool calm, he made several notes. He had no intention of showing weakness. He wasn't going to show Zoe what she had done to him. "After the X-ray, tell the orderly to take you to my office. Depending on the extent of the damage, I will prescribe pain medication for you." Ethan wrote a referral for an X-ray and tore the paper off the pad. "I'll go get the orderly." Before he could leave, she grabbed his hand. It wasn't strong, but the grip was like a vice he couldn't move. His mind flashed back to the times when her gentle touch had made his life much less miserable for 10 years. Quietly, he closed the screen completely and turned to face her. "Sorry," she said through swollen lips. "Excuse me. I didn't know you were at Mount Sinai now. I wouldn't have come if I had known." Zoe let go of his hand, and it sank limply along his body. She tried to smile as best she could. "What do you want?" he asked hoarsely. "Nothing. I don't have any plans. I've already caused you enough pain." "I'm not going to be the reason for more," she said. "You don't have to treat me, Ethan. Whether you like it or not, I have to. Today, I am in charge of the reception department." Her good eye ran over his figure from top to bottom. "You look good, Ethan. Much better than I remember. Zoe, are you sure these bruises appeared after falling in the bathroom? You lie and do it badly." "Yes," she begged. "I don't care what you think. This is exactly what happened." "Did your husband do this to you? You know that I have to file a police report if I suspect that he did this. Please, I beg you, don't do this. Don't make my life any more difficult." He handed her a handkerchief so she could wipe away a few tears. "You must be feeling avenged right now." "I left you and got what I deserved," she whispered. "No, I never wanted this for you. No matter what you did, I never wished you pain." But even as he said this, Ethan felt a sweet sense of gloating inside. It would be a lie to say that he did not feel the slightest satisfaction. This is human nature. "I believe you, Ethan. You are the best person I have ever met. Our breakup tore me up inside, just like I think it did you. And yet you continued with it, no matter what. Then divorce him, free yourself again. This isn't the first time for you, he spat bitterly. It took him several deep breaths to regain his calm. Sorry, I didn't mean to say it like that, he added. It doesn't matter. It's my fault. I left the most wonderful person in the world for a stupid dream of wealth. I deserve everything I get. Do you think that putting up with your husband beating you is a punishment? Do you think you're punishing yourself for breaking up with me? Ethan said coldly. This is nothing compared to what I went through after you left me. You broke my heart into a million pieces. Nothing you do for yourself will compare to this. With these words, he went out to call the orderly. He never looked back at Zoe. An hour later, he was in his apartment, curled up next to a bottle of whiskey. All the memories he had so carefully locked away came flooding back to him. The pinker they seemed, the more painful it became. He walked over to the chest of drawers and opened the top drawer. Among the clothes lay a jewelry box. With trembling fingers, he opened it and saw a gold medallion on a chain. Opening it, he saw two tiny portraits of him and Zoe. A strangled sob caught in his throat. Ethan realized that he couldn't let go of the past. I can't believe you missed the film festival yesterday. It took so much effort to get tickets. Ethan didn't answer. They were sitting in the Maria restaurant, preparing to enjoy the best tortellini and ragu in Manhattan, but his mind was far away. Samantha looked at him, narrowing her eyes. Finally, she snapped her fingers in front of his face to regain his attention. Sorry, what? He muttered. What's wrong with you? Samantha asked insistently. You said almost nothing today. I was just thinking. About what? She asked, raising an eyebrow. About work, he waved it off. You're lying, Samantha said, wiping her mouth with a napkin. Ethan looked at his food, which remained untouched, suddenly losing his appetite. What can't you tell me? She asked sincerely, taking his hand. I won't judge, you know that. This is... He began, frantically trying to find an excuse. Finally, he gave in and put down the cutlery. Zoe came to the emergency department yesterday. He briefly, and as less painfully as possible, told her about their meeting. Her eyes widened with each subsequent sentence, and she squeezed his hand tightly. It took him the longest 10 minutes of his life to tell. Is that all? She asked. Ethan nodded. You should tell the police. I can't, he said calmly. She begged me not to do this and said that she would refuse to testify. I have no absolute proof that her husband did this. So you're just going to watch her get beaten up. Is that the kind of person you are? He didn't know what to answer. He really wanted to find the right words. I know you, Ethan. If you don't do anything, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Who said that I won't regret it if I do? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Don't frown like that. This is just for a month. Ethan opened the door for Samantha and her luggage. She was flying to Hong Kong to cover the final days of student protests. He walked her to the terminal entrance at JFK and waited while she pulled out her documents for inspection. She glanced at him, noticing the familiar sadness she was trying to rid him of. Suddenly, she hugged him tightly and kissed him on the cheek. I'll be back as soon as possible, I promise. They said their goodbyes, and Ethan returned to his apartment. It was still early, and he needed to get ready for work. Everything happened as if by inertia. He prepared himself a minimal breakfast and went outside. Everything remained the same, but something was different. He didn't realize how much he would miss Samantha. Dr. Cole, there is a woman waiting in front of your office. She's been here for quite some time. Ethan saw Zoe on the couch. She was dressed simply. There were almost no bruises on her face. She almost resembled the woman he had once fallen in love with 10 years ago. Come in, he invited her. Glad to see you're recovering. Ethan, I want you to stop protecting me. I already told you I'm not going to apply. Yesterday, 2 police officers came to my house and asked if I had been abused. I had to listen to them for over an hour, and they looked at me like I was a typical woman who refuses to testify against her husband. The irony of this phrase hung in the air. I had to get them out before Milo's returned from work. If he had seen them, things would have gotten much worse. Do you hear yourself? Ethan said, slamming his fist on the table. You're afraid of him and still don't want to testify. Zoe recoiled in fear, her eyes flashing. A nearby nurse knocked on the door to make sure everything was okay. Ethan lied and sent her back, then turned back to his ex-wife. I don't have time for this now. Then I'll wait downstairs like before. My shift has just started. Are you planning to wait 8 hours? This has never been a problem before. She smiled and stood up. For the rest of the day, Ethan seemed to wander in a fog. He moved from one patient to another, unable to concentrate. His documentation was clearly incomplete, and he sat silently at a case conference at which he was asked to speak. 6 o'clock in the evening couldn't come fast enough. As promised, Zoe waited patiently in the hospital lobby. She stood up and followed him outside. They went to the nearest cafe and sat down at a table. Does your husband know you're here? Milo's? He's in Edison now, meeting with a client. Meeting with a client? Isn't he an investment banker? Was. His company was one of the largest in the city. One day, he made a huge investment in a company whose shares plummeted. He lost his job, and we lost everything: house, cars, briefcase. Literally everything. He has been taking orders locally ever since. Zoe looked at him, then at her cup. The first few months were like a fairy tale. We got married in Monaco and spent our honeymoon in Milan. Every day was a new adventure. We flew to Key West, St. Moritz, and Tallinn in the same week. Sounds like a dream, Ethan said, taking a sip of espresso. Zoe plunged into memories with a smile. You probably won't believe it, but even in those days I often thought about you. I constantly thought about the pain I caused you. It was so unfair. Sometimes I dreamed of returning everything back, but I was afraid to do it. What happened to him after the collapse? Milo's took this to heart. He started drinking every day. The money I earned was not enough to support his usual lifestyle. We sold the house to pay off his debts and moved into the slums. It was all we could afford. That's when he started. Ethan began, pointing at her face. Zoe nodded sadly. At first it was out of disappointment that he couldn't find a permanent job. Then because there wasn't enough money for drinks. Then because he made the wrong bet. He always needed to find a reason. I became the most convenient target. Despite all this, do you want to sue him or leave him? No, she sobbed. He is my husband. I promise to be with him until death do us part. I think you're taking that part of the oath too literally, he replied dryly. After all, you made the same promises to me, and it wasn't difficult for you to throw them away. Don't say that, she asked. For 10 years you had my undivided and deep feeling of love. If it means something to you, please don't say it. Ethan quietly continued drinking his coffee. Milo's is all I have left. I can't leave him. You have more. He began immediately, but stopped without finishing. Zoe quickly looked into his eyes with her piercing gaze that once made his heart flutter. Who else do I have? Is it you? No. This is not me and will never be me again. I won't take you back after what you did. Every time I see you, I only think about you and Milo's in that damn hotel. Nothing will change that. I miss you so much it hurts, Ethan. He felt the old desire for her love awaken in him. All those feelings that he tried so hard to bury came to life again, demanding only one thing: to hug her, kiss her, and feel her warmth again. And then a picture of that restaurant appeared in his head. It was almost a year ago, but every detail was remembered perfectly. The rain, the drinks, the designer dress, the laughter, and that fateful kiss, all of it suddenly hit him like a punch to the stomach. Silently, he finished his coffee. Stop fooling yourself, Zoe. It's not me you miss. It's the exotic vacations and sports cars. The remains of her coffee spilled onto the table as she quickly headed for the exit, suppressing sobs. A few seconds later, she was already on the street, and Ethan managed to notice her, tearful, running past the glass window of the cafe. Please let me in. Ethan left the half-empty bottle and looked through the door peephole. Zoe stood on the threshold with an expression of mortal fear on her face. He opened the door, and she staggered as she stepped inside. "Sorry for coming here, Ethan. I didn't know where else to go." "What's happened?" "Milo's lost his job and drank too much. He was furious, such fury as I had never seen before. He threw bottles, plates, and everything that came to hand. I ran away, and he chased me for a while until I got on the bus. I can't go home tonight. He'll kill me, I swear." "How did you find out where I live?" "I found your business card in the reception department," she answered, breathing heavily. "Can I stay here for the night? In the morning, when he sobers up, I will return home." "Of course," he replied, without having time to think it through properly. "I'll cook dinner." "Let me," Zoe offered. She opened the refrigerator and selected a few ingredients. It reminded him of his past life. So much had changed since the last time she cooked for him. "Please, Zoe, for God's sake, sue him. You continue to suffer for nothing. I have already forgiven you for everything. No need to torture yourself anymore." "Why sue?" "Because he drank and broke several plates. This will only make him even more angry." Zoe focused all her energy on cooking the chicken perfectly. For a moment, lost between layers of reality, all that mattered was cooking dinner for Ethan. She forgot about unpaid bills, her abusive husband, and broken dreams. They ate. Zoe was especially hungry. Ethan enjoyed home-cooked food for the first time in months. No one spoke at dinner. "Ethan, I want to ask you one thing. Only about one thing. I want you to sleep with me tonight. I miss your kisses, your touches, and your words. Please let me be your wife for just one night." He looked at her, surprised by her request. She wiped the tears from her eyes and said, "I cheated on you with Milo's. It's only fair that I do this to him." "Two wrongs don't make a right, Zoe." "Never did." Before he could turn away, she threw her dress to the floor. His gaze involuntarily stopped at her body, covered only by thin underwear. There were visible scars and cuts on her torso in various stages of healing. "What did he do to you?" Ethan slowly walked over to her, holding her by the waist, and laid her down on the bed. His lips touched her stomach and began to kiss along the stretched skin. He kissed all her wounds, each of which tore his soul. "Please, Ethan, I need this." She moaned and moved under him. "So much time has passed." She said it, and he thought the same thing. He looked at her ample breasts and the body he knew so well. Gradually, she returned to the arms of her ex-husband, feeling his warm hands holding her close to his bare chest. She felt safe, a feeling that had not left her in recent days. It took all her strength not to burst into tears on his shoulder. She quietly fell into a deep sleep. The morning light filtered through the windows and played on her face. She stirred, trying to return to her dream world. The body that was holding her also moved, gently laying her down on the bed. "It's morning, Zoe," Ethan said. "I know. Let me sleep a little longer, and I'll go, I promise. Stay for breakfast. It will be nice to finally eat a proper breakfast and not something from a street cart." "As you say," she muttered without opening her eyes. Simple eggs and bacon and toast have never tasted so good. They ate in silence. Finally, Ethan could not stand it and blurted out, "Zoe, please sue Milo's. I have already forgiven you for what you did. You don't have to suffer anymore. Now go and get rid of him." She placed her knife and fork on the table and took a deep breath. "Ethan, I'll ask you one question. If I leave Milo's, will you marry me again? Can you find it within yourself to take me back?" He didn't say anything. Zoe stared at him for a few seconds before he answered, "I'm sorry, Zoe, but I can't do this. I will love you forever, but I won't be able to trust you anymore." She reached out and took his hand. "I don't blame you, Ethan. What I did deserves the most severe punishment. If this punishment is marriage to Milo's Petrick, so be it. But I said that I forgive you." Zoe looked at him again with a face full of sad regret. "I never said that I forgive myself." "What? Did she come to your house last night?" Samantha looked unhappy, even though she was over 8,000 miles away via FaceTime. Ethan rubbed his eyes, not yet fully awake, and nodded. "What happened?" She was looking for shelter from her husband for one night. She cooked us dinner, and we went to bed. He deliberately did not talk about what happened next. Samantha stared at him for a few seconds, and then rolled over and raised the phone into the air so he could see her face from above. I have to go to lunch with local journalists, but I'll contact you later. You can count on it. Ethan turned off his phone and spent the next hour looking at her Instagram photos. Samantha had many photos of the protests, as well as views of the impressive Hong Kong skyline and pier. He settled on a selfie where her face was partially obscured by the rising sun over the coast. Her blonde hair fluttered in the wind, and the sun's rays illuminated it, forming a glow around her face. The smile was constant in all the photos. He closed the phone and crawled back under the covers. He missed that smile more than he thought. The next day, Ethan couldn't concentrate at work. Every new patient who came seemed like Zoe to him. He hadn't heard anything about her. I didn't know how she was, whether she was alive and well. Zoe still held his heart tightly. He needed to know how she was. From time to time, he would talk to Samantha, grateful for the minutes she could give him between her work. She listened to him carefully and said that it was okay to worry about the person you loved. There were moments when he would talk the whole conversation, and she would just listen and nod. It gave him more comfort than he could have imagined. He visited their old haunts, coffee shops, diners, shopping malls. Physically, he was present there, but in his soul, he remained somewhere far away. Finally, he walked past Washington Square Park, remembering their first date, if it could be called a date. He stopped to admire a street artist painting a realistic crack in the asphalt. Many people gathered around, some holding cameras to record the process. Hello. Ethan turned around and saw the cheerful young artist who had once painted him and Samantha. She was wearing a simple jumpsuit and a beret. Is your girlfriend not with you this time? No, she is in Hong Kong for work. It's a pity, she pouted. How about a single portrait? I'm great at singles. Why not? Clapping her hands with delight, she dragged him into the park and sat him down next to the fountain. She smoothed his hair and turned his head so that it was lightly lit by the evening sun. That's it. Hold this pose. Ethan tried not to move. The girl set to work, applying quick brush strokes to the canvas at incredible speed. She stepped back to memorize a few more details, then took a fresh brush stroke from the palette and went back to her work. Are you serious with her? She asked, continuing to draw the details of his stubble and eyes. It's complicated. She finished the details with grace and stood back to admire the result. Here, look. This time, the picture looked happier. Ethan seemed to be who he used to be again. How much do I owe you? He asked, taking out his wallet. He took a photo of the painting and sent it to Samantha. When Ethan finally returned home, he found Zoe waiting for him at the door. She was tired from standing against the wall for a long time. How long did you wait? A few hours, she replied with a smile. No problem. I just wanted to see you when you come back. Where is your husband? Milo's. He is now in Syracuse, trying to get a temporary job at his friend's agency. Ethan carefully examined her from head to toe. She opened her coat, revealing that there wasn't much clothing underneath. One thing was clear in her gaze. The reason for her coming was obvious. So you will cheat on your husband again? He asked with slight contempt. At least this time with someone I love, she replied bitterly, but with a smile. He almost laughed at her statement. Her face was as gloomy and devastated as he had seen it since she arrived at the emergency room. The only time there was a different expression on her face was when they were intimate. Ethan swore, cursing his weakness in front of her. He could not deny that he was unable to deny her that one drop of light that could, at least for a moment, illuminate her gloomy life. He opened the door and let her in. A few minutes later, her clothes were already lying on the floor. More bruises appeared on her body, but Ethan's gaze was drawn to her eyes. They still had that spark of passion and pain that he knew all too well. A few minutes later, he was lying in bed, clutching her to his sweaty body. Zoe smiled blissfully. Let's stay like this for a little longer. Zoe, please. I'll do anything you want, just leave your husband. I forgive you everything. You don't have to suffer anymore." His words hung in the air as if something important had not been said. Zoe raised her head and looked at him carefully, waiting for him to continue, holding her breath. When he didn't continue, she smiled sadly and kissed him again. "Don't say things you don't mean, Ethan. Please, at least disrespect me. Don't hurt yourself trying to save me. I can't be saved anymore." "No, don't say that," he said pleadingly. "I still love you. I love you too, more than you can imagine. And that's why I can't let you take me back. I can't live with myself seeing the pain on your face every time you look at me. You will try to hide it. You will try to pretend that everything is fine for my sake, but I know you better. I know you'll die inside." Ethan looked at her silently with his mouth open. Zoe looked at the clock on the bedside table. "It's time for me to leave. Milo's will be back soon." Ethan felt deep pain, but couldn't find the words to stop it. "Same time tomorrow," she said goodbye. She broke his heart like a child's dreams, threw away their marriage like spoiled leftovers, and trampled him along the way. Ethan knew all this. He remembered every painful detail, like a broken record in his head that played the same scenes from his life over and over again. But why then did it sting so much to see her in such a degraded state? Why did his heart hurt when all her bruises, welts, and scars came to mind? Why did he allow her into his apartment and have sex with her over and over again while she stood there begging him? The answer was where it always was. In a velvet box locked in a drawer of his closet, a beautiful gold medallion with 2 photos from the past. He opened it every night to look at it. It was a portal to the past that he wanted to return to more than anything else. On the nights when Zoe was gone, he looked at his little time machine and told his story to a bottle of scotch. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan had sex with his ex-wife sporadically. It was satisfying for both of them, but it didn't have the spark of their marriage. It all happened at his house, their dirty little secret. Then came the day he saw her at Mount Sinai Hospital. He was on an extended shift and was taking a break near the emergency room entrance. It immediately became clear that something was wrong. She ran in, shouting to call a doctor. The attendant stopped her, but Ethan intervened and pulled her aside. "What's happened?" "Milo's got into a fight in a bar. He is badly injured." "Where is he?" "They're bringing him in an ambulance." "Please, Ethan, you have to save him." He rushed to the ambulance entrance and saw paramedics loading someone onto a gurney. He ran to the nearest paramedic. "How bad is it?" "Very bad. He suffered fractures to his neck, ribs, and pelvis. Extensive internal bleeding. We barely had time to get him to the hospital." "Prepare him for emergency surgery," he shouted to the orderlies. "Tell Dr. Jorgensen to assemble a team for emergency multisystem surgery. Find out his blood type and take 5 units from the bank." Immediately, he rushed on. Even while running, he called to prepare or 5. The team had already gathered and began to change into sterile clothes. Ethan joined them, making sure he was completely sterile. He looked through the glass doors of the operating room and saw Zoe's face, which had tears on it. This sight burned a hole in his heart. Even after everything that had happened, it was still hard for him to see her cry. Now is not the time for distractions. He double-checked himself and entered the main operating room. His eyes were clenched and his determination was steely. Despite his personal feelings, Milos Petrick was a patient like any other who needed help. Zoe was sitting in the waiting room. Her eyes were glued to the clock. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hours. Every moment of time that passed in the painful uncertainty of her husband's fate was torture. People came and went from the waiting room. Every step made her hope. It was already past 2 in the morning when the doors to the operating room opened. Ethan walked out, still in his surgical gown. His hands and the front of his robe were covered in several disgusting blood stains. He looked too tired to walk straight, exhausted from the efforts of the operation. He stopped, leaning against the wall of the emergency room. Zoe approached him softly and placed her hand on his shoulder. He slowly turned his tired eyes towards her and shook his head. "I'm really sorry. We did everything we could. His ribs were completely broken and bone fragments pierced his lungs, kidneys, liver, and heart. He also suffered a severe blow to the head and was nearly brain dead when he was brought in. There was nothing we could do. The sound of a thud sounded as Zoe's eyes closed and her knees buckled. She collapsed on the floor. Ethan immediately knelt down and pulled her head into his hands. Doctors and nurses immediately surrounded them. Ethan spent the night in the hospital, making sure Zoe was moved to a private room. She was sedated with sleeping pills, partly because he could not bear to see her awake and grief-stricken. The next day passed in a blur of bodies, paperwork, and meetings. It was evening when the head doctor insisted that he go home and catch up on lost sleep. His legs felt like lead. Last night, he saw Milos Petrich's face for the third time. The first two were during Zoya's affair with him. In those moments, he often fantasized about what he would like to do to him. Perhaps for the briefest of moments, he even considered the possibility of doing so. Fantasies were cheap. When he saw the mutilated body of his sworn enemy on the operating table, his blood froze. Milos's face was almost unrecognizable from the blows he had received. It was a fate he would not wish on even his worst enemy, not even Milos Petrich. Ethan needed a distraction from the horror of the previous evening. He needed to talk to someone who could understand him. He dialed the number that had recently returned to his speed dial. "This is a surprise. From the moment I called you endlessly until you picked up the phone, to the point that now you call me yourself. To what do I owe such an honor? Very funny, Val. I just wanted to know how you are doing. Let me guess. One of your patients just died, and you suddenly had a moment of weakness, so you decided to call me. Am I right?" Ethan smiled. His sister had always been amazingly perceptive when it came to him. His long silence answered her question. She continued, "Well, you've called to the right place because I have an idea to distract you from all this. How about you come and visit us sometime? Stop by. To Greenville? God, does it sound so terrible when I say it? You've spent 2/3 of your life here. It can't be that bad. Spend a few days with us. Just so you and Father can gloat about how my marriage fell apart like you predicted from the beginning." "No, thanks." "Ethan," Valerie said seriously, "nobody is going to say that. I know you don't like us, but we haven't seen you for 10 damn years." Ethan paused to let his tired brain process what he had just said. Val spoke again. "Father misses you too. He actually asked me to persuade you to come. He's too afraid to do it himself." "Does my father want me to come?" Ethan chuckled. "What's happened? Did he lose his punching bag?" "Ethan," she shouted. "No matter what happens, this man is still our father, and you will not talk about him like that. Are you seriously defending him after everything he's done?" "Yes," Valerie said firmly. "I told you before, and I'll tell you now. He's not at all the way you remember him. Since Mom died and you left, he's been going to anger management classes and meetings. Next month will mark his 5 years of sobriety, if you say so. Ethan, one thing I've never done is lie to you, and I'm not going to start now. I said everything I wanted. Now I can only hope that you will turn out to be a bigger person." The call ended. Ethan stood up from the bench near the ambulances. Zoya's face, stained with tears, and Milos's face appeared in his head. How unfair it was that Milos could influence him even after his death. He walked out of the hospital to see Sam waiting for him with 2 mochaccino lattes and a big smile. "Did you miss me?" A sudden rush of emotion made him hug her tightly. She barely managed to keep her coffee from spilling on the sidewalk. "More than I can tell you. I've never seen him like this, Damien." "He just sat there and cried," Samantha said. "Is it true?" Damien responded in surprise. He was rolling the best cannabis from his stash into joints, handing one to Sam and lighting it for her. She took a deep drag and continued. "Everything was inside him. He gave way to tears. He told me about his ex-wife and her husband. It was painful to watch. But now it's all in the past, and that's the main thing." "Hardly," she said, exhaling smoke at the ceiling. Damien looked at her and took another drag. "He still hasn't let go of his ex." I'm sure they slept together while I was away. Did he tell you about this? No, but he is a terrible liar, especially when it comes to me. I knew right away the first time we talked on FaceTime, and you didn't bring it up. It's none of my business, she said, blowing a cloud of smoke in front of her face. It's not like I'm his girlfriend or anything. There was a long pause. And whose fault is this? You fell in love with him, and only I know it. He's still going through a divorce. I don't think it's worth imposing this on him now. She didn't have time to finish because her partner, being in the same state, interrupted her. It's clear. You think the best option is to let him pine endlessly for his ex-wife. You and I both know that I'm not suitable for the role of a girl, she said, clearing away the smoke that obscured her face. God, how many years have passed since I allowed a man to even touch me? Just touch. You didn't choose what happened to you, Damien replied. You don't have to suffer for this for the rest of your life. But it happened, Samantha blurted out. You can't deny it, you can't pretend it didn't happen. I'm broken, and we both know it. Ethan deserves someone better. Someone like your old self? Samantha nodded, exhaling another stream of smoke. Then become your old self. Show Ethan the Samantha Pendergast who loved life more than anyone I know. I'm trying, damn it, she blurted out. All these damn psychiatrists keep telling me I need to accept what happened and move on. It was as if one of them had been locked in a room for days on end. You can't just get over it. You survive, but you don't get through it. You're still in that room, aren't you? This is your personal prison. If you stay in this limbo, they will win. They broke you. You have to move on, Sam. You know that I always wanted only the best for you. I know it will be hard, but Ethan already has a lot of problems of his own, she interrupted him. He himself is stuck in his own limbo. He needs you, Sam, and whether you like to admit it or not, you need him. You two are the only ones who can understand what you both are going through. Trust him, for both of your sakes. They smoked in silence for several minutes before Samantha spoke again. You're a great therapist when you're high, you know. We see, yes. Even if I wanted to tell Ethan how I felt about him, it would be a complete mess. I would definitely scare him. Damien stood up and, spreading his arms wide, took a pose as if inviting her to dance. Samantha laughed. Someday you will find the right words, and they will be simple. Okay, Kerouac, she said, putting her arm around his shoulders to help him stay on his feet. It's time to send you to bed. Thank you, Damien. I really needed to hear this. You are an amazing person, Samantha. Any guy would be happy to be with you. Now go tell that to Ethan. I'll tell you. You're as hopeless a liar as he is, Damien muttered in his half-asleep prostration. Good night. Samantha stayed next to his bed until he fell asleep. The next day, Ethan continued to be lost in thoughts. The events of the past 24 hours had aged him several years. He spent a sleepless night staring at an empty wall, and it showed. There was a pile of documents on his desk, but he couldn't bring himself to start working. There was a knock on the door. To you, Miss Pendergast. Let him come in. Sam walked into his office and sat down opposite him. A small mountain of papers towered between them. Sorry about the mess, Ethan said without looking up. It's all about work. How is Zoe? She asked, genuinely concerned. She was discharged in the morning. She said that she needed some time to think things over and arrange her husband's funeral. I don't know where she is now. Do you need some time alone? She asked. I can meet you later. No, please. Stay. Talking to you yesterday really helped me feel better. How about you and I take a little break from all this? Samantha suggested. You probably have a few days of vacation. He barely nodded when she voiced her idea. Surprisingly, Ethan did not reject her outright, as he would have done before. Why not? He reasoned. He was at a point in his life where he had nothing left to destroy, but needed to rebuild one important bridge. So he and Sam planned to rent a car and drive to his hometown of Greenville. So this is where you grew up? Sam asked, looking at the rows of houses along the main road. We're not in the actual city yet, but yeah, Ethan replied, taking his hand off the steering wheel to point. "This is my school." They repaired it. She raised the camera and quickly took a photo. The small, suburban-style houses were a welcome change from the long rows of apartment complexes in the city. "I have to admit, this is not at all what I imagined when you said small town upstate. Damn, I wish there was a department store like this in Soho. Believe me, 10 years ago, it was the most ordinary small town." "What's happened? Has anyone found gold?" Sam laughed. "No, but my sister decided to take every small family business to the next level. People come from neighboring cities to shop here. Your sister, are you close to her?" "We haven't seen each other for 10 years. I didn't come to Greenville, and she never stopped by to see me when she was in town. A couple of awkward calls a year is the limit of our relationship." "Wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. We quarreled over Zoya, and since then everything has remained that way. Val and I used to be really close." "Do your parents live here too?" Sam asked. Ethan rarely talked about his family, and Samantha never inquired, but now he was different. "Father, yes. One of the main reasons my sister stays here is to take care of him. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 17. Sam took a few more pictures until Ethan drove up the gravel driveway to a gray two-story house. It appeared to have been recently painted and was significantly larger than the houses next door. Ethan turned off the engine and froze. She looked at him, noticing that he took a deep breath to calm his nerves. Instinctively, she placed her hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time. We will get through this together." She helped him out. They walked past an open garage. Sam counted a Maserati, a Jaguar, and a Bentley among several other shiny models that she couldn't identify. "What does your sister do?" "Entrepreneurship." They both turned around and saw a woman in her early 30s standing with her hands on her waist and a sly smile. "Although, if you need an official title, then I will say that I am the general director." For a few seconds, Ethan simply looked into her eyes. She looked completely different from how he remembered her. 10 years have given her more confidence and strength. But underneath it all, he still saw her as the same Valerie he knew. Sam gently pushed him forward, and he took a step towards his sister. Physically, they were several feet apart, but emotionally, they were a gulf. Valerie waited patiently on the other side. Finally, he got close enough to see her blue eyes looking up at him. And then suddenly she grabbed him in a tight hug, pressed her face to his chest, and squeezed her brother tightly in her arms. "Welcome back, Ethan. Welcome home. This is a pleasant surprise." "You didn't say you were seeing anyone else," Valerie began, lightly teasing. "Aren't you going to introduce us?" Sam pushed. "Yes, sure. Val, this is my friend Sam. Sam, you've already heard about my sister." "Nice to meet you," Sam said, shaking Valerie's hand. "Ethan told me a lot about you." "Probably nothing good, right?" Sam was confused for a moment, but Valerie playfully hit Ethan on the arm. "I remember you telling me all the little details about your dates with Zoe, but not a word about Sam." Ethan and Samantha froze at the mention of Zoe. Feeling that she had touched a sore spot, Valerie hurried to invite them to the front door. "I repainted the old house. He looks better, doesn't he?" He nodded. "So you're the CEO," Sam began. "What does your company do?" "Venture capital. Maybe you've heard of Cole and Greer PLC. Did you hear?" Sam exclaimed in amazement. It's impossible not to notice her in the Wall Street Journal. "Why do you live here and not in the city?" "Everything related to my work can be resolved by phone or video conference. I have my own office to monitor stocks if needed. I also sometimes go to Manhattan to remind the board of directors that I'm still alive." A fresh breeze blew through the morning air and Valerie closed her eyes, enjoying the soothing feeling of the country wind on her skin. There is something here that cannot be found in the concrete jungle. Things are more important than money. I like living here. Ethan told me that you did a lot for this city. This is my personal project. I invest in small businesses across the country. I give them capital so they can reach the next level. There are plenty of success stories here if you're interested. She owns a controlling interest in. Well, almost every business in this town, Ethan added. Enough about me. Let me introduce you to the rest of the family. Ethan, came a shrill voice that he had not heard for a long time. He saw a barely recognizable woman come out to the door to greet them. Sarah. I didn't recognize you for a second, Ethan exclaimed, hugging her. Sam, meet Sarah Gardner. She lived across the house. You missed the point that you were the only one she let into her treehouse, Valerie muttered. Sarah laughed and gave Valerie a quick kiss on the cheek. How long have you been married? Sam asked. 5 years next month, Valerie beamed. We even have a child through IVF. Where's Colin? He's sleeping on Grandpa's lap, last time I checked. We'll wake him up soon. My God, I can't believe you're actually here, Ethan. I thought Val was joking when she said you were coming. They sat down in the cozy living room. Valerie called the maid to bring some food. Sam, what are you doing? I'm a photographer. Currently, I am not collaborating with any specific magazine or publication. Show them that magazine, Ethan laughed. But Sam gave him such a look that the idea quickly disappeared. Do you live in the city too, Sam? Sarah continued. Yes. Colin is about to wake up, came a rough voice from the next room. Someone wants it. The phrase stopped mid-sentence. Ethan stood up and turned around to face the father he hadn't seen in 10 years. His hair was almost completely white, but his skin remained as rough as before. Even though he was over 60, he still kept in shape. His massive figure blocked the doorway. I'll go check on Colin, Sarah said quickly and disappeared. I'll get my things from the car, Sam began, but Ethan held out his hand to stop her. His father's eyes flickered to Sam and then back to Ethan. Arthur Cole spent his entire life as a Greenville police officer. On rare occasions, his life was endangered while on duty. But never in his life had he been as afraid as he was now, looking at his estranged son. Nice to see you, Ethan. We haven't seen each other for so long, said Arthur. He didn't know what to answer. Arthur accepted his silence and nodded slowly. I understand. This is a lot to comprehend. Take your time and tell me when you're ready. The only thing I want you to know is that I am ashamed of everything I put you and your sister through. I would give my life to fix this. Ethan had many words on his tongue that he wanted to say to his father. Memories of scars and bruises, of nights spent on the cold veranda, of missed dinners if he was a minute late to the table. They were all seething inside him. Valerie intervened and took her brother's hand, gently guiding him towards his father. There was no hug, just a cold look and a tense handshake. It wasn't much, but it was still a start. You'll never guess where you'll stop, Valerie announced joyfully, at the Woodford Inn. She pointed to an imposing building on the outskirts of the city. Ethan looked in amazement at how the dilapidated 19th century house had been transformed. It was given a new look, painted and windows replaced. It looked completely different from the abandoned house he remembered from his childhood. Can't be. The old Woodford Inn. No one has stayed there for 40 years. Well, I own it now, so I restored it. Now it has everything: a jacuzzi, a 4-poster bed, a chef, a maid, the whole package. Not at all what I remember. Do you remember how much trouble we caused in this place back then? Valerie laughed. Of course. Valerie put her arm around his shoulders and leaned gently against him. Admit it, you missed this city, even if just a little. Sam stood at a distance, photographing the colonial-style building. Valerie looked at her. If you don't mind my asking, Ethan, how are things serious between you and her? She's a friend who helped me deal with a lot of things. This is where we are and where we are comfortable. Are you sure she sees it the same way? She came here with you. That says a lot. Ethan stopped and took his sister's hand, pressing it to his chest. Valerie, you have always been straightforward, and that's why I ask you this. How did you understand then that Zoe and I would eventually break up? You were both too young. You haven't seen enough of the world to make a commitment. That's the only reason I supported my father then. And you were right, he cursed, kicking a stone. No, I wasn't. You had 10 wonderful years of marriage. Do you know how many people live their entire lives without experiencing this? Finally, stop thinking about what went wrong and thank fate for what you had. Sam and Ethan settled into the master bedroom. He took a hot shower and shaved. Later that evening, there was a small party at his sister's house. Half the city was going to come, if only to see the return of the prodigal son. There was a knock on the door. Valerie stood with a basket of cupcakes in her hands. Just like old times, huh, Ethan? Exactly, he agreed. Dad sends me to bed without dinner, and Mom sneaks food to you while he's too drunk to notice. These are cupcakes from Andy's bakery down the street. You remember, right? Your favorite blueberry muffins. Sam, you should definitely try this, Ethan said, quickly eating one. Exactly the same as I remember them. They are complimentary. My guests receive special treatment in this city. My brother, well, you can imagine. You can get everything you want here for free while you're here. I want to go to Andy's bakery later. Now they have orders from all over the state. Large orders for weddings and conferences. You're kidding, right? This little candy store? It's much bigger now, Valerie laughed. I'm her silent partner. I'll order some of these cupcakes to New York, Sam blurted out. I'm having a party soon, and I'd like to serve them. Can you give me their business card? Speaking of parties, Valerie hastened to change the subject. We're late for one. It's time to go, hurry up. Half an hour later, Sam and Ethan stood wide-eyed among a crowd of people eager to meet them. Ethan smiled and pretended to remember everyone who reached out to him. All his classmates who were in town came and were upset that he did not remember the smallest details of their school life. Ethan had put a lot of effort into completely cutting himself off from his past, and it showed. He apologized to the last few people who were surprised that he didn't remember them, and went in search of Valerie or Samantha. He noticed his sister surrounded by a group of children. Smiling, he walked closer to get a better look at what they were doing. Valerie was sitting at the table playing 3-card Montu. Try to find the queen, she said, quickly shuffling 3 cards face down. The children watched her hands in surprise, trying not to lose sight of the desired card. When she finished, she looked up. So, where is the lady? A quiet argument began between the children. They whispered and discussed their guesses. Ethan chuckled quietly before speaking. Not in any of these cards. The lady is in your pocket. Hey, Valerie shouted with feigned anger. You don't even play, but it's not a game if no one can win. There's no money here, she answered, grinning. I do this for fun. In high school, you made good money by tricking naive tourists from the city into doing this trick. We had to start somewhere, she laughed. Let's go, I'll introduce you to my friends. He glanced behind him to see Samantha deep in conversation with a group of young female students. She took out a camera and showed them its capabilities. After an hour of hanging out with Valerie's friends, Ethan grabbed a cold can of Budweiser and walked out onto the porch. Arthur sat in a rocking chair with a child on his lap and a glass in his hand. Before you ask, this is a fruit beer. No alcohol. Well, then to your health, Ethan replied, sitting down next to him. They silently watched the bustle of people around. Handsome, huh? Arthur carefully lifted the baby. Ethan gently ran his hand over his nephew's head and nodded. You still haven't decided whether you're ready to accept my apology, right, son? Ethan didn't answer, just took a sip of his beer. It's okay. All I can hope for is that you will accept it in time. My biggest regret in life is that your mother never saw this side of me. She died knowing me only as the monster I was. I'm glad you changed your life. Really, I'm glad. It took me so much therapy to realize such a simple truth, that I was hurting my own family, the people I should have loved the most. Are you a pacifist now? Let's just say I won't let your sister even put an electric insect trap in the garden. Ethan laughed and took another sip. But don't think I've forgotten how to hurt people, Ethan. If anyone dares to touch you, your sister, Sarah, or even little Colin, I swear on your mother's grave that I will bring down the full wrath of heaven upon them. You need to suffer for your family, but not hurt them. The loud voice made Colin stir. Arthur began to gently rock him until he fell asleep again. Tell me about Sam. Does she make you happy? He does. Very. Then that's enough for me. I'm not going to make the same mistake I made with you and Zoe. You too have my blessing. The party was gradually coming to an end. Samantha made a big impression on everyone among the townspeople. Everyone who passed by shook her and Ethan's hands and invited them to dinner. They smiled until their jaws ached. Finally, Valerie asked her driver to take them back to the Woodford Inn. Too tired to eat anything else, they simply went to bed. Wake up. Samantha wrinkled her face without opening her eyes. Ethan shook her again. It's not morning yet, she moaned, pulling the blanket over her head. But he didn't back down and threw the blanket off her again, finally waking her up. Why don't you let me sleep? She muttered, wrinkling her forehead with displeasure. I want to show you something, he said. That was my favorite thing about this place. Sam jumped out of her half-asleep state when she saw Ethan open the window. He was already standing on the lower part of the roof, holding out his hand to her. Carefully, some shingles may be loose. After some effort, they both sat down next to each other, looking at the horizon. There was a faint red glow in the sky, a harbinger of the rising sun. Their view stretched into the distance, beautifully framed by two hills. Now you will see the most beautiful thing in this city, he said. He turned to look at Samantha, who had meanwhile climbed back through the window. A few minutes later, she returned, holding her camera. Ethan, have you ever taken a selfie with a DSLR? Well, now we will have the highest quality selfie ever. They waited until part of the sun rose above the horizon. A fiery semicircle, covered with clouds, gradually made its way through their shreds, illuminating the sky. The redness on the horizon faded into a thin layer of soft purple haze that separated night and day. Sam paused for a moment, admiring the palette, before snapping a photo. She turned her back to the sun, extended the camera, pointing the lens towards herself. Come here, Ethan. Before he could react, she kissed him on the cheek, and the camera clicked. Her assessment was accurate. The light from the rising sun softly illuminated their faces. Even the tiny gap between them glowed with the sun's rays. This won't go on Instagram, she said with a satisfied smile. This is just for us. Ethan touched his cheek where her lips had just been. When her lips touched his, the sunrise suddenly seemed so ordinary. Ethan, are you listening? Samantha smiled. I asked if we wanted to frame this. He didn't answer her question. Instead, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, and he pulled her towards him, pressing a kiss to her lips. He kissed her deeply and tenderly, exploring her mouth and enjoying the closeness. Samantha was so stunned by his unexpected outburst that she did not immediately react. When their lips parted, she looked dazed, her eyes clouded. I'm sorry, Sam, Ethan whispered. I don't know what came over me. I shouldn't have done this. To hell with him, she answered, and again hungrily pressed her lips to his. She hugged his neck and leaned in for a kiss. Their eyes were closed, her tongue dancing and wrestling with his. Their lips parted again, and they looked into each other's eyes for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. But not now, Samantha whispered. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they continued to silently admire the sunrise. The next day passed in a whirlwind of laughter and color. The moment came when Ethan had to leave the house again. Before leaving, Valerie took him aside. This is my personal number, Ethan. Call me anytime, for any reason. Whatever you need, I will do everything I can to help. No questions asked. He hugged his sister one last time before getting into the car. Sam played with little Colin's fingers with her hand out the passenger window. Goodbye, Sam. Come again, Sarah shouted. You can be sure, Sam replied. It was evening, and they were approaching the city limits. Now Samantha was driving. Suddenly, she turned off the road onto a hill. Where are we going? I want to take a couple of pictures, silly. I haven't practiced trick photography for a long time. Reluctantly, Ethan allowed her to pull him out of the car and stand on a large boulder. He extended his hand, and Sam directed the lens so that in his palm there appeared to be a fireball, the setting sun. Then she made him pose as if he were lifting a distant hill. She had more ideas, but Ethan refused with a grumble and returned to the car. The air was filled with fireflies, flickering lights in the almost darkness. It was like a mirror image of countless stars scattered across the black night sky. The red hue of the setting sun, which was still fighting for its place in the sky, gradually gave way to deep twilight. The area of returning birds and insects, the dim light of the crescent moon, all this created a mesmerizing atmosphere. But none of these details made this moment special. Ethan's eyes were glued to Samantha's nonchalant figure as she took pictures of nature. She looked so calm and happy despite what she had been through. He didn't know her whole story, but he felt like she was connected to something truly traumatic. Everything her parents said to him at his birthday party hinted at this, and that was enough for him. Suddenly, Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. Samantha's father was calling. "Mr. Pendergast, is Samantha with you?" The voice on the phone was full of anxiety. Ethan instantly knew something was wrong. Mr. Pendergast's usually loud voice trembled with emotion. "Yes, she is here, taking photographs. Should I call her?" "No, don't. I can't bring myself to talk to her now. Ethan, I need to ask you to do something very difficult. Sorry to put this on you." "What's happened?" "There is something you need to tell Samantha. I'm not brave enough to do it myself." There was a long pause, during which Ethan took a deep breath, preparing for the worst. "Tell Sam." Mr. Pendergast's voice trembled even more. "Tell her that her brother will not come home again." The rest of the words were drowned in sobs. Ethan dropped the phone and his hand fell limp. He took a deep breath, letting out a long, heavy exhale. A memory of a party at her brother's house flashed through his mind. He had never met him in person, but from conversations he knew that James was loved by everyone and would be greatly missed. Ethan didn't know her brother well, but he was sure that there was now a huge void in the Pendergast house. "Ethan, one more shot, and we can go back to town," Sam shouted cheerfully from the place where she was taking pictures. He turned towards her voice. She looked so joyful and content with her life, camera in hand, a wide smile on her face. "Come on, Ethan, don't be a bore." Ethan couldn't bring himself to look her in the eyes. Sam lowered the camera and looked into the car, trying to understand what happened. "What's happened?" she asked softly. The curse of this burden placed upon him by her father weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was on the verge of ruining her happiness. He was about to witness her wide smile disappear from her face and give way to something much heavier. Ethan quietly opened the door and hugged her. He grabbed her face and pulled her close, closing his eyes. Ethan was not a religious man, but he prayed for strength to see his friend cry. A man went to war for his country. All that was left of him was a coffin wrapped in a flag. Major James Pendergast was killed in action. The mission turned out to be a strategic success that will undoubtedly save many lives in the future. But this was little consolation for those who remained in the rear. The army won a decisive victory. The man died. Brother, son, husband, father, all these roles were destroyed in a hail of bullets as he bravely defended his country. The world was cruel and unfair, and the price was too high. Sam stood aside and watched as her brother's coffin was carried in. All her life she had imagined this moment in her nightmares. Now she couldn't wake up. Her eyes, clouded with tears, looked at James' wife, Thalia, who stood frantically clutching a handkerchief to her face. The coffin was lowered into the grave. Uniformed soldiers raised their guns to salute. "Mommy, why are they putting Daddy in the ground?" asked Lana, James' daughter, holding Thalia's skirt and tugging on it. "They're burying him, dear," Talia answered, barely holding back her voice. "They can't bury him. He must protect us. Dad promised me that he would protect us." Talia picked Lana up and held her tightly. There was a huge hole in her heart, and she needed to feel the warmth of her daughter, if only to delude herself that this hole could be filled. Large tears flowed from her face onto Lana. "Stop burying Dad. Tell them to stop burying him. He promised to protect me. He promised to be at my birthday. He must be there," Lana sobbed pitifully. Not a single person among those gathered was left with a dry eye. Friends and colleagues felt the chill of their own mortality. All his medals and awards will now become just memories, and memories, as we know, are a dangerous thing when you are trying to hold on to those who are no longer around. Samantha stood a little to the side. Her heart was bleeding and her eyes were full of tears, but she had no one to turn to cry. She couldn't bring herself to shed those tears, knowing that James wouldn't want her to. Her family had already lost one pillar, and she couldn't let them see another one crumble. For the first time in her life, Samantha felt like she wanted to fall apart and let all her feelings out. But she reminded herself that she had to be strong for her family, and she absorbed all her pain into herself, already overwhelmed with grief. Her body was almost too numb to feel someone's hand on her shoulder. She slowly turned around to see Ethan standing next to her with a soft, knowing smile. She didn't know, but he was simply repaying her for the comfort she had given him throughout the past year. The dam of her endurance finally broke. Samantha grabbed his coat and pulled him towards her. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed like she had never cried before. At that moment, Samantha Pendergast realized that she still had a shoulder to cry on. The Creator could not be so cruel as to take that away from her. Ethan drove her home after the funeral. All the way Sam sat, clinging tightly to him, crying quietly. This was the first time he had seen this side of her, and it was excruciating. Her face, devoid of joy, was covered with streaks of tears mixed with smudged mascara. She sobbed, her chest rising and falling with each thrust. Some of her sobs caught in her throat, unable to find a way out. Ethan put his arm around her, holding her tightly to comfort her. Samantha looked up at him with her eyes full of tears and smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ethan." "You're welcome," he answered quietly. "I want you to know something about the night we kissed. Please, you don't need to think about it now. We'll talk about this when it's easier." "Ethan," she lightly punched him on the chest. "You are so kind. You never tried to take advantage of me. You never put pressure on me. Do you know what my main principle in life is? I never wait. The only thing that is constant is change. Every day is a new adventure, new places, new people. But one thing I've learned over the past few months is that there are people worth waiting for. You are one of them." They drove up to her house. Sam got out of the car and turned around through the rolled-down window. "When you're ready to take the next step, I'll be here, ready to take it with you." She leaned over and kissed Ethan again. Her soft lips left a warm memory on his skin. "See you soon, Ethan." He watched her slender figure disappear behind the door. He quietly ran a finger over his lips where hers had just been. In that brief moment when their lips touched, he felt like he could be whole again. Another day, another mountain of work. Life in the hospital was invariably predictable due to the volume of cases. Ethan scanned the papers in front of him, but couldn't bring himself to start. He paced back and forth in his office, trying to comprehend what Samantha had told him last night. He touched his lips, closing his eyes, remembering her kiss again. Her smell, touch, look, all this was forever imprinted in his memory. It was nectar, the residual taste of which he wanted to taste for a long time. When the day finally came to an end, Ethan got ready to go home. There was a burden in his head that he decided to get rid of. Going down to the lobby, he saw a familiar face which he did not expect to see at all. Zoe. She looked considerably older after the events of recent months. She was wearing a simple dress and skirt with a coat. For a few seconds, she reminded him of the woman he had once returned home to after a long day. "I came to say goodbye, Ethan. My cousin found me a job at a private practice in Hartford. It took me a long time to process this, but I made a decision. I needed to get away from all of this. I need to start over in a place where I won't constantly remind myself of my mistakes." He smiled and put his hands on her shoulders. "I'm happy for you. Really, I'm glad." This was the first time since the divorce that he had seen her face without a single trace of bruises. Zoe looked much better. "So this really is the end." "It was over a year ago," Zoe answered. "We just took it too long." Ethan let go of her shoulders and put his hands in his pants pockets. "I have something for you." He took out a velvet box and handed it to Zoe. She opened it with curiosity and took out an elegant gold medallion with a clasp. Open it. She pressed a small button and the locket opened. What she saw inside made her press her hand to her mouth and then to her heart, trying to suppress the surging emotions. On one side was a photo of her taken in St. Catherine's Park, where she was illuminated by the rays of the sun. On the other hand, Ethan's smile. I ordered it for you more than a year ago. In fact, I was going to give it to you the day I first saw you with Milo's. You kept it all this time. I tried to throw it away, really. But I couldn't. Be that as it may, we lived 10 wonderful years together. I couldn't pretend they weren't there. Zoe fastened the locket and rubbed it with her fingers. Her eyes dropped down, hiding her tears. Zoe? She hugged him and pressed herself against his shoulder. Their lips met in a short but tender farewell kiss. She wanted to remember this kiss, to keep it as a treasured memory for all the lonely nights in New England. Promise me one thing, Ethan, she said quietly. Will you promise? I promise. Promise me you'll tell the next woman you date that she's the luckiest girl in the world. And promise that you will love her the way you loved me. With those words, the woman who was once Zoe Morneau Cole walked away. Ethan watched her go until she disappeared into a taxi. That's it. The weight of hatred that had been weighing on his neck all this time had finally lifted. He took out his phone and dialed a number on the speed dial. Sam, I'm ready. I'll come to you tonight. Later that night, Ethan walked into Samantha's apartment, not knowing what to expect. Scented candles were burning in the living room. Damien had just finished lighting the last one. You're lucky, he smiled at Ethan. I'm leaving. He left, making another joke at the end about how he could use bisexuals. Ethan just shook his head in embarrassment. Come in, a voice came from her bedroom. Ethan opened the door and saw Samantha standing by the bed, completely naked. The lights were dim and a slow quartet tune played quietly in the background. He just stood there, dumbfounded. His eyes greedily absorbed her naked body, slender hips, toned stomach, and beautiful breasts. Her eyes watched him, full of challenge, inviting him to take the next step. Come to me. She sat down on the bed and patted the spot next to her. Her gaze followed him from the door to the very edge of the bed. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest. Talia told me that you can probably guess why I avoid relationships so much. You probably learned this at your birthday party, right? Ethan nodded. How much did they tell you? Enough to understand that it was something truly terrible. That's enough for me. She squeezed his hand tighter. Can you see me, Ethan? She whispered. I am naked before you in all my truth. I want you to know everything that happened before we take the next step. You don't have to tell me this, he said gently. I don't want you to go through this again. I want to, she answered firmly. It's not fair that everyone is moving forward, but I'm stuck in the worst moment of my life. Before this happened, I was the life of the party, and that's the kind of woman you deserve to be with. This will be the hardest thing I've ever done, but I want to tell you what happened to me. Ethan smiled at her and gently brushed a strand of her hair out of her face. I would be honored to hear this. Samantha smiled back at him and pressed her naked body against his chest. Ethan put his arm around her, pressing her head against his shoulder as she began her story. It happened 3 years ago. I was in Barcelona, visiting my artist friend. Oh God, you're going to propose to her. Even while in Greenville, Valerie could not hide her delight. Yes, Ethan answered, sitting on the edge of the bed in Samantha's apartment. He looked back and saw her naked body curled up among the sheets. Her first sex in many years turned out to be a real masterpiece. Parts of his body that he didn't even know existed throbbed with pleasure. Have you already thought about how you are going to propose? The sister continued. Not yet. Don't worry. I'll be in Manhattan next week and I'll book you a table at Le Cirque. Leave everything to me and I promise that she will not forget this evening. Will you have time? He asked. Don't you have a lot of work? Nonsense. Valerie waved it off. I will always find time to help my brother. I would be very grateful. Wait, Sarah wants to talk to you. The next voice Ethan heard was Sarah's excited and high-pitched voice. Ethan, congratulations. When is the wedding? Where will the ceremony be? What will you name your children? Please name the girl Lily. I would love to spoil a niece named Lily Cole. Hey, you're getting too ahead of yourself, Ethan laughed. We haven't discussed such details yet. Sorry, I'm so happy for you. I'll go get Arthur. Don't hang up. At the family home in Greenville, Sarah hurried through the house to hand the phone to Arthur. Valerie finished rocking the baby before picking up an old photograph, a snapshot of her, Ethan, and their mother when Valerie was 10 years old. She smiled, looking at her childish face as she hugged her little brother, as if protecting him. Mom made me promise that I will always take care of you, Valerie thought. That's all you need to know. She was right. There were things Ethan didn't need to know, like the fact that ever since Ethan called her after a night out, heartbroken that his marriage was on the rocks, she's been secretly looking for information about Zoe and the man she betrayed him with. There's also the fact that over a year ago, Valerie made a strange business decision to sell the bulk of the shares her company held in a promising mining company. This triggered a panic sell-off that sent the company's shares plummeting to insignificance. And also the fact that Milos Petrick invested millions in this company. Millions that disappeared overnight, leaving him in financial bankruptcy as deep as his moral decline. Truly, these were things Ethan didn't need to know about. Subscribe to our channel so that your love does not cheat on you, and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you are under 18 years old, do not even think about moving on to the next one.